saw the headline, I usually write. I figure it's more presidential not to read.
With all your executive time?
While we're waiting, I'll tell you all that I have a sick child at home. I'm gonna try not to be distracted by
By us. You mean by us?
that.
Do you want to do instructions? We want to do those with the commissioners, I don't think.
But my phone is out for that purpose. And hopefully Dad can provide sufficient support. Given a lot of instructions. Do not go to the emergency room unless you call the doctor's office first and talk to them. Those kinds of instructions.
My famous line from my husband when we had 3 kids and I was going away and I was giving him instructions was, Laura, I will take care of them as if they are my own. I have not given him instructions since. I was humble. He still screws it up, but I keep my mouth shut.
Grateful for the effort, right?
Yeah. It's really important to know who had the red cup.
Oh, yes.
God,
Oh, yes. Call us to order and we'll start
Great.
introductions if that's okay. So, good afternoon, good afternoon, I'm gonna call us to order at 4:07. Welcome everybody to our VEHI board meeting of December 20th, 2018. As this is only the second time some board members are together at the same table, and because we have a number of guests, I'd like to start with introductions around the table, maybe going this way. I'm Tracy Rend. My day job is as superintendent of Lamoille South Supervisory Union, and I'm a VEHI board member and have been serving as chair for 5 years or so.
Laura Soares, VEHI president.
Martha Gagne, my day job is business manager at Maple Run Unified School District in St. Albans. And I've been on the VEHI board for I don't know how long. 5 years. Yeah.
And I'm Elizabeth Fitzgerald. I serve on the South Burlington School Board, and I've been on the VEHI board for about 4 years.
Fran Brock, I'm a history teacher at Burlington High School.
I'm Joel Cook, I'm Vermont EA's former executive director, and I was on the board for 16 years. And before that, I was involved in the creation of VEHI. Now I'm representing Vermont EA. That's one of these 3 appointees.
Peggy Maxfield, I teach math at Bradbury Area Middle School.
I'm Bobby Yosons, and I work for VEHI, I'm Trust Administrator.
Mark Hage, I'm a VEHI Trust Administrator for Vermont.
Hi, I'm Anna Van Fleet, I'm a rate and form analyst at the state.
And I'm Mike Pichek, I'm the commissioner at the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation.
The first traditional, yes, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Nicole Mace, I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association.
Thank you, Nicole, welcome.
Don Tenney, President of Vermont NEA.
Welcome,
Robert Wadowski, I'm a professor of business administration at St. Michael's College.
welcome. Thank you all for being here. The first order of business is public comment. Is there anyone here who would like to address the board on an item not on the agenda? Nicole?
I would.
Thank you.
So I wanted to let the board know that we have received a resignation from Elizabeth Fitzgerald effective tomorrow, I believe. And so pursuant to our process for appointing members to the VEHI board, we have appointed Robert to replace her effective tomorrow. So that's why Robert is here with us today. I'm also, so everyone's aware, recording the meetings. It's our plan to do so. The VSBA regularly records our board meetings because our members have an interest in what transpires at our meetings, and sometimes narratives can catch fire and misunderstandings happen, and so we find in the interest of transparency and accountability to our membership that recording meetings is the best way to just put it out there. So we do plan to put those recordings on our website along with the recordings of our board meetings, since we are responsible pursuant to the law for 50% of this board. That's it.
Thank you for all of that information, Nicole. Any other public comment? The next item of business is a review of the agenda. As we begin our collective board oversight of VEHI, I'll defer what I wanted to do, which was a review of the mission. But want to begin by saying that the agenda was constructed to assist the new board members. I know
have
your
a motion,
request.
my suggestion is now a motion. I move that rather than do this now, that we hear from the commissioner directly and let him go, because the discussion of the agenda itself appeals to me as though it's going to take a certain amount of time.
Thank you for your consideration. If you'd let me finish, what I would have explained was the way that public meetings are required to operate under Vermont law, which include commencing meetings with an opportunity for public comment and a review of agenda. And after that explanation, invite the opportunity to return to that question after my explanation, so that we can defer to our guest and be respectful of his time. So if I may, please make that brief introduction, because it is very clear that as a new board with members who have not served on this or perhaps any board in the past, there is a need for some modeling and explicit clarification about good board operations consistent with Vermont's public meeting law. So modify my thoughts and what I'd say about that, if I may, and briefly indicate that the agenda was constructed to assist new board members with beginning to orient themselves to the work of the VEHI board, and to structure an agenda that's welcoming of questions and suggestions that have been raised at the October meeting, and reinforced and reminded by you, Joel, via email since that time, as well as to attend to the work that is essential for the operations of the VEHI board, including positioning us for thoughtful conversations and ongoing work related to the oversight of this board of an intermunicipal insurance association, which is essentially a self-insurance pool that serves the employees of public education and some non-public education institutions in Vermont, school districts, and has an impact on all in the state of Vermont. As I indicated when I responded to your inquiry, the review of agenda is an important step of a public meeting, and it's important also to remember, however, that additions and amendments to agendas, while they can be made at the start of a meeting, if possible, it is best practice that those amendments be made or agenda items be added well in advance of the meeting so they can be on the agenda, as it is best practice for the public who may be observing our work to know what's on the table. Understanding that there is an interest in reviewing the agenda and considering additions or amendments to the agenda, and as I indicated earlier, would like to come back to this item, and unless anyone objects, transition to the next item on the agenda, which is some time with Commissioner Pichek. Any objections? Seeing none, welcome, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, thanks for having me. So I'll kick it off here. I think everyone has a copy of the PowerPoint that we sent around, and thank you to Anna Van Fleet for putting that presentation together with Emily Brown, who's on vacation and couldn't be here, but Emily and Anna do a lot of the work at our department from a forms perspective, filing perspective, and then we have a licensing department as well that looks a lot on the financial side. And some different team there, but Anna does a lot of the bulk of the work and is very familiar with VEHI and VEHI's operations, so I'm glad that she could be here with us today as well. And I'll just mention, Peggy, I went to the Brattleboro area middle school, and my niece is there right now.
I've got Riley, she's
Yeah.
my advisee and one of my math students, I had Kayla a couple years ago.
Okay,
So yes,
good.
I wanted to say hello.
So Riley asked me if, she texted me last night at like, I don't know, 9 p.m. saying, are you gonna come to my class today to be interviewed in Mr. Rivers' history class? And I was like, oh, I thought we hadn't confirmed that. So you can,
I said, oh, I think I'll
So
be
you-
at a meeting with him.
Yeah. So you can tell her that I did actually have a conflict. And I asked, can we do it by Skype? And she said, Mr. Rivers doesn't want to, you have to be there in person or no deal.
It's a great program, I hope you can make it.
Yeah, I think next winter for sure,
Sure.
this winter, yeah. So, so we have on the first page here an overview of the department. We used to be called BISHCA, Banking, Insurance, Securities, Healthcare Administration. Healthcare Administration broke off to become the Green Mountain Care Board. Then we rebranded ourselves as DFR around 2013. We have four main divisions: the Insurance Division, which VEHI is regulated by, the Securities Division, which regulates broker-dealers, investment advisors, investments in Vermont, and the such. Captive insurance, which Vermont is actually, if you don't know about it, is a worldwide leader in captive insurance. We have licensed over 1,100 captive insurance companies, some of the biggest names in the world. We have 48 of the Fortune 100 companies have their captive in Vermont. 18 of the Dow Jones Industrial 30 have their captive here in Vermont. So that's a very important piece of our department. And then the banking division, so like the Vermont State Employees Credit Union, the state chartered credit union we regulate, Northfield Savings Bank just down the road, state chartered bank, that division regulates as well. On the insurance side and VEHI side, we have probably about a dozen to 18 domiciled insurance companies in Vermont that we regulate from a solvency perspective. And from rate and form perspective, obviously, as well. But we have many more companies than that sell into Vermont, upwards of 1,000 or more that we review and make sure that their products are compliant with our laws before they're able to sell you auto insurance or homeowners insurance, for example. So just to level set, the primary purpose of our department is consumer driven. We're here to protect the Vermont consumer. We're also here to protect the marketplace, to ensure that there are availability of products in the marketplace, but then ultimately that the Vermont consumer is being treated fairly, that the pricing that they're provided makes sense, that people are going to be there to stand behind their promises that they've made, particularly on the insurance side. So solvency is our greatest consumer protection, our greatest concern. Whether that's with VEHI or any of our regulated companies that we, that we have under our supervision, to make sure that people can make good on their promises. So VEHI, as we mentioned, is an intermunicipal insurance association. You see here, Title 24 provides the approval of VEHI or any intermunicipal insurance association, adoption of rules, which the department has done, which is Regulation I-90. So if you want to know a little bit more about your legal structure, those are the two places to go, Title 24 and then Regulation I-90. So VEHI, has been around longer than this, but it became an intermunicipal in 2013 and has been under DFR's regulation and supervision since that time. And we've enjoyed a very good relationship with Laura and with the board, to the extent that we've had a relationship with the board, and just from a insurance good practices standpoint, thank everybody for taking the time to be on the board, and it's a voluntary element to some degree, and it takes a lot of time, and I heard a lot of people that were from not very close to here, so there's a lot of traveling that was associated. So certainly, from a regulator standpoint, appreciate everyone's involvement and volunteerism. So what does DFR do vis-a-vis VEHI? As I mentioned, we have sort of a financial component, so we look at VEHI's operational and financial plan, ensure that there's a sufficient amount of capital on hand to pay ongoing obligations. All of our companies have, some reserves, for lack of a better word, you could call it surplus. And that reserve and surplus is there, again, to ensure solvency, to ensure the protection of Vermonters, that if things go bad, and maybe they go bad for many years, that there is a cushion there to help prevent people's life insurance from going unpaid or their health insurance from going unpaid. And that obviously is critically important to Vermonters and to the VEHI members. So we review and approve the bylaws of VEHI, and then also the membership agreement you see here, the medical program. So I mentioned the rates and forms. It's kind of a technical word for the benefits and coverage and the premiums, the rates that are charged to the members. So we review that from an actuarial standpoint. We determine, you have a rate of X, so what goes into that rate? Why do you think you have to charge members that amount? Because we expect to have this many claims, and our claims are made up of these types of illnesses or these types of treatments, and you sort of actuarially calculate out a specific number. And then also the dental program as well. So those are the ways, again, that we mainly interact with the VEHI on the financial solvency plan, and then also reviewing the forms and the rates that are filed on a yearly basis as well. We have what's called sort of examination authority. So all of these domestic companies that we regulate, we do examinations every 5 years or so. I think VEHI just had an examination in the last year and a half. So you won't be due for another one for a little while. But we also do quarterly and yearly filings as well and look at the financials, not just on a 5-year basis. But that's when we actually come here and have a much more detailed review. So I think everybody's familiar with Act 11 that came out of the special session last year. You have here the language that says 3 members shall be appointed by the organization representing the majority of the public school boards in the state who shall not be employees of the organization, and also 3 members appointed by the labor organization representing the greatest number of public school employees in the state, not to be an employee of that organization. So certainly this will be the big change that's coming to VEHI in terms of the board compensation. And new board members are coming on board as well. So we wanted to make sure that we gave sort of an overview of what the department is, what we do and who we are. So as questions come up along the way, obviously Laura is a great source of information. Laura contacts Anna and Emily with some frequency, but just so that you know who we are and can reach out to us at an appropriate time as well. So I did want to just go into a little bit of detail about, I think this stuff is pretty self-evident on this next page. I wanted to go into some of the discussion about the board duties, just in case there's folks here that haven't served on a board, a corporate board or a nonprofit board, and talk, oh yeah.
Where are you in the updating the unbinding rules? I don't know if you're gonna come to that at the end.
Yeah,
Is important.
so I think we have updated that. I think we have it on here, remember, I saw it on here when I looked at it yesterday.
More to the point, do you have a copy of what you've done? Or could you?
It was a pretty like slight change, because it basically just talked about the compensation of the board.
I mean, it doesn't affect us.
Yeah,
We had to revise it, there was a kind of a threshold of majority,
right.
and we just had to revise that a little bit.
Thank you.
So we'll get, I'll mention that to Emily, and we'll get you a copy of that and give you an update as to where we are in the process. But as I know, we have certainly done the work in terms of what we think we have to do to amend it, and it's in process. I actually thought maybe it was done, but if you haven't seen a final copy yet, then I guess it's not.
No, when we talked to Emily in October, she said early 2019.
Yeah,
Right.
so as you all know, there's a administrative rules process that takes a little bit of time. Our position was that the statute trumps the rule anyway, and so we are cleaning up the regulation, but I think the statute is the operative document here. And the rulemaking process has a couple of steps and public comment period and such, so sometimes it's hard to determine, exactly when you're going to have a certain date of something complete by. So I mentioned the fiduciary duties of the board. I think, it's helpful always to have these discussions, particularly, once a year, I would say, or as frequently as you can do it on the board, because these are certainly theoretical topics, but then when you think about how they come up on a day-to-day basis or on a meeting-by-meeting basis, I mean, they are not infrequent that there might be some challenges to some of these fiduciary duties for individual members. But essentially, the three duties are the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. So to break those down a little bit, and again, even before breaking down the specifics, I think it's important to think about who the fiduciary duty is owed to. So in this case, it's very clear that we act, or you act, I should say, as fiduciaries to the members of VEHI. That is who owns the fiduciary obligation of you as a board member. So regardless of if you work at a particular school or a particular business, you have an association with a particular association, whatever it might be outside of VEHI, obviously you think about your fiduciary duties to the organization, to the members, when you're in this particular seat. So
Do you
what,
define members? Because
Yeah.
that's a term that we use for multiple meanings.
yeah,
So are you talking members as in school employees who have coverage, or members as in the school district municipalities?
And be very careful.
well, I mean, if you think of VEHI, I mean, you think of it as kind of both. I mean, in some ways, because I mean, you owe to your members of school districts, you owe an obligation to. You owe an obligation that extends down to the individual teachers and staff members as well. Because if you don't have the cash on hand to pay for their health insurance, that obviously is the group that's impacted, both from a financial standpoint at the school district, but then also on the individual human element with the staff person or the teacher. So, I think you have to be thinking about them both and thinking about the organization as a whole as well when contemplating that. So, the duty of care, you can think of this as your ability as a board member to do your due diligence on important decisions, to do your due diligence on VEHI as an association. What are the important issues that VEHI is facing? What does the organization do from a day-to-day basis? The duty of care doesn't always need to be exercised by you as a board member or the board. You can delegate some of those duties. For example, if you have investments, you can have an investment advisor help guide the board. If you have legal issues, you can have a lawyer help guide the board, outside consultants potentially, depending on what the matter is. But the duty of care really focuses on you being in a position where you have sufficient information to make an informed decision about the subject matter at hand. And when you think, I didn't put it on here, but people sometimes get worried about legal liability, of course, when serving on a corporate board or a nonprofit board. And particularly, duty of loyalty comes up as well, but the duty of care is one where board members are often critiqued, or a board is often critiqued as not having thought through a decision in sufficient detail, not having gotten the right expertise or the right information. So this is one, again, a fulsome discussion at a board meeting, asking those questions that are in your head. I mean, that's one good way I think of it is, if you have that question in your head, and even if you think it might be a silly question, a very basic duty of care is to ask that question so that you can get that information that you need to make the decision. And then, of course, just simple things like coming to the meetings, being present, physically and mentally present, and such. Any questions on that particular prong? So duty of loyalty, I mean, again, loyalty to the organization. So I think of this in a couple of different ways. The most clear one is conflicts of interest. I see here a disclosure form, so that's a good housekeeping item. Thinking about conflicts in terms of financial conflicts, obviously those can be pretty clear. Whether your decision as a board member, one way or the other, would benefit you financially. Thinking about also learning, the information that you learn in a VEHI meeting, particularly things in executive session that aren't for public consumption, shouldn't be things that you then somehow use in your private life or in some other life capacity to benefit yourself or benefit some other organization or company. So for example, if you served on a corporate board and you learned about, so that they were going to close down a certain product line, you can't go back to your sort of CEO job at XYZ company and say, here's this great business opportunity for us. So you could wrap that up into sort of a general confidentiality requirement, particularly for sensitive information and private information. So again, that duty of loyalty, really ensuring that there's no conflicts. If you think there's a conflict, talk to the board chair. It's better to be transparent about that. And then there's always ways, for the most part, to mitigate those conflicts, whether it's being absent for a vote, stepping back from a vote, or meeting, removing yourself from a decision. or eliminating the conflict in whatever way it can be. And I think people should be mindful, because in Vermont, I mean, this just comes up all the time. I mean, my niece's advisor is in the room, you know. So, I mean, Vermont is a small place, and people know a lot of people, and they serve many hats, and people come at each other in many different ways. So I experience this certainly in my role as commissioner. I serve on the Vermont State College board, so you can think about ways where those things have to be navigated as well. So I think it's important to always try to mitigate any appearance of conflict as well. I think the appearance of conflict is where people run into trouble in Vermont more than an actual conflict, just because we are such a small knit state. So be mindful of that, and certainly talk to the board chair if there are questions about a particular issue. You can document it, and in that way, you know, insulate yourself and protect yourself, and make the right decision in terms of whether you should participate or not, or whether there is a true conflict. So then the duty of obedience is sort of the final one, and maybe the most, in some ways, the most amorphous. But I think basically it boils down to, you know, are you following, is the organization following the law? Is it following the law of both the you know, the items that I just mentioned, but obviously all the other laws that are out there as well? Is it following its mission? Are you fulfilling your mission as a board? You talked about that you're going to review the mission statement, so that's good. So I think you really think about that as is the board being obedient to the law, the guideposts that are out there, and being obedient to the mission of the association as well. So you know, that's sort of a high level you know, overview of those good corporate governance items. You could have a whole retreat that talks about corporate governance for multiple days, because these are sort of the baseline fiduciaries, but then of course there are things like, you know, what are best practices or good practices for a board? How do you facilitate discussion? How do you not avoid conflict, but how do you have conflict that leads to good results and resolution, right? So how do you have those types of difficult conversations? And those are things that, again, you could find 1,000 consultants everywhere that will come in and talk at great length about how to do that, and maybe that's a good idea since there is a new configuration and new board members. But these are just sort of the baselines as you as a individual on this board to think about in this capacity. But again, thinking about well-functioning boards, there's a whole other litany of things that you can do. So I would certainly encourage you to think about those as well as a board, and potentially, you know, examine that. So I want to make sure that I answer any questions that people have, whether on this corporate governance items or on what the department does, or any VEHI related questions.
I have a couple.
Yeah.
I think Emily appeared at the October meeting, right? I haven't met Emily yet, but she was there. And she said something about bylaws, and I asked a question about bylaws. And I think my question was essentially, does DFR's oversight of this organization imply that it controls the bylaws themselves? She said no. That was a one-word answer. It was the right answer. But you've included bylaws here as part of your regulatory oversight.
Yes, we approve the bylaws. There's a bylaw change.
All right. And so what are you looking for?
Yeah, so I mean,
Approving bylaws?
yeah, it's a good question.
Unlike solvency issues, which are both art and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of something.
I know, I'm confused.
So, for example, we wouldn't, if there was a policy decision within a bylaw, right, to say, you know, you could do A or could do B.
As long as it's
You know,
lawful.
yeah, we wouldn't look at it and say, well, you chose B, but we think you should do A. I mean, we try to stay out of that
You
sort of
won't do that,
operational.
right.
But if, for example, we say, you know, you've included in your bylaw something that is counter to I-90 or counter to Title 24 or some other, you know, regulatory concept, obviously, that's what we're looking for.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But my only other question is a matter of curiosity.
Yeah.
You're in an appointed position, and you're overseeing a whole bunch of organizations. So I'm sitting here trying to figure out why you picked this one to make an appearance at like this.
Yeah.
Do you do this normally?
Well, I certainly wanted to come in and I do frequently meet with presidents and CEOs. I'm going to Passumpsic Bank next week. I think I actually got scheduled for January
For
to
a
meet with their
loan or a
board.
presentation?
No, for a presentation.
Okay.
So, you know, it's not every day that I would go to a board meeting, but certainly on the other hand, I've only been commissioner for 2.5 years, but I can't think of a situation where a board, you know, has had its composition changed from outside forces. So I just wanted to make sure that, you know, that the new board members understood the department, our role that we play, and knew who we were and knew how to contact us.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So understanding that you need to check on where the revisions to the changes
Yep.
to the I-90 and the other thing that needs to be changed are, but what we believe is that that process, that first step will be hopefully completed in January. What is the process for bylaw changes and/or policy changes that require DFR review and/or notification and/or approval? My recollection is some things need approval and some things just need, you need to know.
Mm-hmm.
And
So is the question sort of like, who do you contact?
what's
or
the
what's
process?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a.
And
you know,
timeline.
Yeah, relatively.
Because we're thinking about a lot
informal.
of steps following the I-90
Yeah, and I think it's
completion.
relatively informal process, but Emily Brown, for those type of things, would be the best point person for you. Some of it obviously determines, you know, these are things I could say to anybody, you know, about a filing, but some of it is based on, you know, the quality of whatever the filing is or the information that we get, the completeness of it, obviously, how complex it is, and then what the workload looks like, you know, at the department at that time in other areas. But certainly, if there are items that have of greater importance to you, or have a strict deadline, just communicate that to Emily, and we always do our best to meet you know, those types of needs for our regulated entities.
Yeah, and I think that we have the licensing group in the insurance division, we have company licensing, and we have then the rates and forms. So Laura's very familiar with some aspects of like rates and forms go through SURF, which is this electronic filing process, and then we have our actuaries look at them. And then on the company licensing side, Chris Roberts sends financials on a quarterly basis to Jesse. And so there's a sort of like we have an email track there, and then on the rates and forms side, we have a very formalized, it's our online filing cabinet where we keep everything. So Emily is a great gatekeeper. We're Jesse and we're all, you know, within feet of each other. So I think Laura has a great sense of, you know, which direction of communication you need. But email is always totally accessible, and we always make sure if something needs to be in the record for SURF that we'll remind you that, you know, that if we have a conversation, we'll memorialize it in the record.
Okay.
And actually company licensing, just to add one more thing, that is all confidential. And what comes through SURF is generally open to the public. So that would be your rate filing and forms that, you know, the kind of the member agreement. And then the financial information for VEHI is kept in a confidential examinations track.
So what I'm hearing is that Laura is skilled at both navigating and understanding the order of operations, timeline, and processes for not only ensuring that we're complying with the regulatory pieces, but managing any changes that we want to make to bylaws or policies or procedures that DFR has a say on.
Tracy, by the same token though, DFR is not suggesting that we not adopt changes, that we not amend our bylaws. It will review amendments to our bylaws.
Yes, I wasn't,
You don't approve them before we adopt them. You can come in and challenge and tell us we have to change them again.
Yeah, so you're saying if the law changed, you didn't take action in a certain way, that your
Right.
bylaws might be out of compliance.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, the statute controls them.
Yeah.
And if you have any more questions about the lengthy process of getting those rates approved, I'd be happy to go into more detail.
Yeah, we got plenty of time for that.
Yeah.
do you have questions for us?
No, I mean, I think I'm interested, I just, you know, interested in hearing if you have any thoughts about, you know, from a regulatory standpoint, you know, how the process unfolds during the year, you know, the various check-in points that you have with the department. Obviously, we're not you don't communicate with us on a daily basis, but there's certain important check-in points relating to the 2020 or 2019 filing, I should say, for example, or the financial pieces or the examination. But are there any questions around that?
I think we captured that in the working calendar, we ordered pretty well.
Yeah, okay, good. Great.
Yeah,
Unless
and
you
we
had
can-
feedback that we weren't compliant.
We can bring new board members or board members who have had a bit of a respite back up to speed with what that timeline and process is. And it will be faster for you
It's
because
apparently,
it's in there.
I can affirm right now that it's like riding a bike.
Yeah, we'll bring you back. Perfect. Get you back on the bike.
Well, I do thank everybody, again, for being here and serving in this capacity, and wish you new board members and soon-to-be new board members the best of luck as you lead the organization, and wish departing board members, all the best of luck as well.
Out of the frying pan.
Well, thank you very much for being with us, and certainly if you have feedback for us, insights, observations, Laura is our lead go-to, and I know you communicate with her regularly, so if you see things that we need to think about or do differently, we're open to that feedback as well.
Great. Well, thank you all. Hope you have a good night. Good meeting you. Yeah.
Good luck at the Thompson.
Thank you.
You need a credit reference, you gotta find somebody.
You're welcome to stay if you
You're
want
gonna
more.
say, how are you?
No,
I have to head back.
no,
No, I don't
no.
mean to, I didn't know if you were planning to stay or not.
And you know, I'm gonna stay for a few minutes if that's
Sure.
okay.
I have to get back to
More
Burlington.
than
My apologies. Winooski technically.
All right, we are going to return to a review of the agenda. I spoke earlier about agenda amendments or additions being at the front of meetings, theoretically, so members of the public could be present and know if we're adding things to the agenda, and know they could leave if they wanted to, I suppose. But also the importance of being as transparent as possible about what's on the agenda up front. I would add that I am planning to stop us with whatever we're working on around our agenda by 6:30 so that we can do the last two items of business, which is setting a board meeting schedule and agenda planning process for the future, which is critical, and making sure we get any of those management updates. They're important background knowledge. And to be clear, anything that we don't get through, we can keep on our plate for future work. So with that, I turn it to you, Joel, as you have expressed in, or Peg.
I just wanted to, I'm not sure the proper order, so
Yeah,
help me out. But I just wanted to let folks know that I do have a proposal for, a motion for protocol for adopting agendas as we go forward. Just seemed like this took a bit for us, and so I thought it might be great, and I'm happy to share that wherever you think it fits best in here.
There's an item on the agenda about agenda process.
So that might be the right place. I just wanted to let you know.
Between 6:30 and 7.
Perfect.
Okay.
And thank you. And again, the intent was to find space for the things that people have raised that they want to discuss
Yes.
in a way that is aligned with a productive plan forward going forward. So hopefully that fits for you. Great. Now back to Joel.
Thank you, Tracy. I don't want to spend time unnecessarily reviewing my last 2 years, but in short form, you might have noticed I put a great deal of work into a certain number of documents here. I don't intend to do that every meeting. I don't want to, but I've had a lot of time to think about things, and in light of Act 11, we, as Vermont EA's delegation to this board, put together a number of proposals, and I took it upon myself to put them in writing, reduce them to writing. That said, I've got 3 preliminary motions, in spite of the fact that one of the motions contains a whole bunch of other motions. And so with that as basic introduction, here's how it goes. The first is a motion to address the minutes of the October 19th meeting. I note that there's nothing in the agenda about approval of minutes. And-
Yeah, number 6.
except for number 6. So I'll hold that off. All right, I've reduced my needs to 2, okay.
And are you making a motion, because I'm keeping minutes, I just want to make sure. Right now.
Not about the October 19th.
No, but are you about to make a motion
Yes,
that I should, so I just
so you
go
should
slow
start
enough,
with-
I can get it
I
right, okay?
haven't, whatever I have in writing,
Oh, great.
and copies.
Can-
Preliminarily,
Can I ask a
I want to,
Sorry, can I ask Claire? We're on this review of agenda, so are we talking about the
these are 2
amendments
motions
to
relating
agenda
to the
process?
agenda.
So
To the agenda, not the process.
motion specific to the agenda, this agenda.
Yes.
So you want to add agenda items?
Well, we can characterize it however we want after you hear what the motions are.
Okay.
It's changing and adding, I guess, but, and it's changing the sequence. In any event, on a preliminary basis, actually, I'll skip that, what I was going to say, because Tracy, in your preliminary remarks, you basically summarized it for me. You said that we should always provide whatever information we want to bring to the attention of the board well in advance. On October 19th, we provided the board a statement and a list of issues, and let you all know that we'd be following up with proposals. And on November 1st, I followed up on that commitment with the proposals that you have in your materials. But you didn't get those materials until, I believe, 2 weeks ago. The organization has had them since November 1st. And I specifically asked on the cover page of those proposals that they be included in the agenda of this meeting. I didn't ask that a mere reference to the document be included in a parentheses next to accompanying item 10 on the agenda, because that doesn't give board members or the public any information whatsoever about the content of those motions. So my first motion, Tracy, is as follows. And again, Laura, I have it in writing, and I'll just distribute it now. And I'll read it as I distributed it. It's about 20 words. I move that the motions that I submitted to VEHI on November 1st, 2018 be considered formally introduced, and that each be considered as it becomes relevant in the course of this meeting. I say that because I was informed before this meeting, a couple of weeks ago, within the last 2 weeks, that motions are not introduced until the meeting. Well, I don't quibble with that, but I think it's fair of me to ask, and of each of us to ask, that to the extent that we submit information for consideration of the board, that it be transmitted to the board efficiently, effectively, and with proper notice, proper attention. That did not happen here. So in any event, my motion is simply to get all these motions now formally introduced. And so I've done so in the form of this three-line motion.
So,
And which has an accompanying explanation, which is not far different from what I've just said. So that's my first motion.
yeah, with all due respect, I'm a little confused process-wise, and want to be clear that what's appropriate under this agenda item is explicit additions to the agenda that are not here.
They're not here, that's the point.
That are not in this motion, that the intent, a couple of things,
I'm listening.
and that, again, as I said earlier, the intent of the agenda design was to be responsive to the issues that you raised in writing on October 19th, and provide intentional opportunities in the flow of the agenda, maybe not in the order that you presented them, but in the flow of the agenda, in the content of the agenda, to be able to explore those issues that you raised.
So, yeah.
Lastly, I want to clarify that my earlier statement this afternoon, I believe, was not necessarily that all the information to be discussed needs to be disseminated prior to a meeting, but that agenda items that are to be discussed should be as clearly as possible communicated on the agenda, so the interested in public would know what we're working on.
Well-
So I apologize if that was confusing.
It was, yeah.
One more piece is that the process for decision-making in a board involves someone making a motion, as you are doing, that should happen at a meeting. The motion is seconded, there's an opportunity to discuss, and ultimately there's an opportunity to vote. So we're headed in that right direction, in that procedural direction, but just want to be sure that that process is clear. So, want to say again, Joel, that I think that we try to be really intentional to find opportunities in the workflow of the business that we think that we need to do to keep the organization on course and prepare us to do ongoing board work to advance ourselves collaboratively as an efficient, effective, and really focused board. That said, if you feel like something explicitly needs to be added to the agenda, feel free to make a motion and we'll take it up.
I just made that motion. I take you at your word, Tracy, but to be blunt, 3 of us, half of the board, notified the chair and the president of our intention to submit these proposals for inclusion in the agenda of this meeting. That did not happen directly. And
To be equally blunt, I think it did. So if you're not satisfied, you have the opportunity to make a motion
okay.
for what you exactly want to have added to the agenda.
All right, okay, so I've made the motion to incorporate, to place before the body all of the motions so that I don't have to.
Well, they aren't motions, the suggestions or the document with topics you'd like discussed.
No, the topics that I'd like to discuss are the subjects of the motions that I've put together on behalf of the 3 of us.
That you anticipate wanting to make later in the meeting. No motions
I
have
do not
been
want to,
made.
I just do not want to leave this meeting without everybody understanding, without assurance that the proposals that we presented in the form of motions under my name on November 1st are in fact now before the board.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, my own feeling is you have requested that, board members sort of look through the more detailed packet of information.
I did that because I couldn't get anybody else to do it.
Well, I did get through most of it, and one of the observations I have is that it seemed like we haven't, as a board, had the discussion yet around strategy. So there were several proposals in there that really represent structure, and
Yes.
I know this is an orientation that I've shared with the board when you served, Joel, previously and subsequent to that really structure should follow strategy as it relates to
Structure-
board operations.
Structure follows strategy, but substance follows process, right? We need, the whole point of Act 11, if we want to get into a discussion about that, if that's permissible, is to reestablish an equality of roles on this board.
And I would say, in my review of Act 11, that the mission of VEHI is what our collective responsibility is here as board members to VEHI, operating within the reconfigured Act 11 board structure. So from that standpoint,
Are we disagreeing? I'm not sure.
I don't think we as a collective board have had the discussion yet of what are our shared goals relative to fulfilling the mission of VEHI, and that is a part of the strategy component, so that a lot of the tactical recommendations that I saw in your longer document really would follow on to, in my opinion, would follow on to those conversations.
I guess in response, I'm not suggesting that again, this is out of an excess of caution, this particular simple motion. I don't want to leave this meeting without these series of motions being understood to be before the board. I'm not suggesting they all be acted on
Okay,
today.
can we be clear that they are not yet motions first?
They're items that you want to add to the agenda.
A motion needs to be
Fine,
brought before.
fine.
Okay.
I don't want
That's
to quibble
step
with you.
one. Okay.
All right, I will conform the language accordingly.
Okay.
As long as the document is now officially before all of you, I'll be fine. And if perchance when the time comes, I don't make a motion, please tell me to, and I will be happy to do
I'm happy to
that.
help you with that.
All right, so that said, this motion, I'll withdraw this particular motion. The other one, however, does relate to the sequencing in the agenda. And it's more complicated. And I'm sorry it's more complicated, but it's more complicated.
For those of you who don't have copies of the information Joel is referring to, there are 3 copies in the middle of the table.
No, not this one.
No, the information in motion one that you wanted to act on, I didn't know if Anna, Nicole, Dawn, or Robert
The
wanted
larger
a copy.
document?
This
There
is
are
the
paper
detailed
copies
information.
right there.
I'm sorry, you are right, of course.
Did you get one of these yesterday?
I don't have as many
So,
copies of this one.
Tracy, I'll suggest here that it may be that I'll withdraw this motion as well.
Okay.
But the motion for the moment is that today's agenda, that the agenda for the December 20th, 2018 meeting presented by the president and chair be amended to ensure that items are taken up in logical and proper sequence, and then as follows. And I'll abbreviate this discussion. The item about board decision-making process really will need to incorporate a reference to one of the motions in the larger document, which isn't referenced in the agenda until item 10. And so that formally doesn't make it relevant before we get to item 10, and that's the problem.
To the extent that one's helpful, it was my intent to, when we got to that agenda item, to look
Nice
to
to
you
know now,
first.
but I surely didn't know in the course of the email
Yeah.
exchanges I've had over the last 2 weeks with you folks. With respect to the conflict of interest statement, I think what you'll find in the discussion anyway is that it puts the logical horse behind the cart, or the logical cart in front of the horse. Until we resolve the issues associated with the conflict of interest policy, it is logically, it is illogical for us to attempt to complete the disclosure forms. And so the purpose of this is to get us to consider the conflict of interest policy before engaging in that. The bylaws require the disclosure, I think it's the bylaws, anyhow, yes, I think it's probably the conflict policy, requires an annual completion of the policy. It doesn't require it to be done at the first meeting. And so it seems to me that we can take care of that in a different context as well. With respect to the election of board and corporate officers, I need to point out first that it's an election of the board's officers and appointment of the corporate officers, so the verb choices a little off. But that said, both of those are the subject, and I think that's what Elizabeth was referring to, at least in part of these motions as well. And I just want to make sure that those motions are considered in that context too. And finally, it is obvious to me anyway, that logic dictates that we consider proposed changes in the process before we engage in the process.
So thanks for sharing that, and I apologize that my one email response to your inquiries wasn't clear enough to convey to you that I felt confident that most, if not all, of the issues you raised, and I'm going to stick to the word issues, even though you use the word motions, because we've already discussed our differing opinions about motions versus topics for discussion. And attempt to reassure you again that despite the order of the agenda, we have ample opportunity to hear the concerns that you've raised and opportunities for addressing those concerns that may be productive and positive while still being attentive to the bylaws and the ongoing traditional operations of the organization. And we certainly can table things we can't resolve for future meetings. We have options for working through these things productively. I believe, and again, can honor and address the questions and concerns that you've raised that you may like to make motions on, because we work on vocabulary.
I'm playing with some words and I can't.
It's okay, I will get tangled too.
I'll come up with a pun somewhere along the way here, but I don't know.
Yes, well, I appreciate your
All right, so
your
what is
linguistic
your,
prowess.
what's your proposed resolution of my motion, therefore?
You have two choices, to make a formal motion, seek a second, and vote on an amendment to the agenda, which I'd like to have be really specific. Or you could say, let's go with it, understanding that I am indicating more clearly than perhaps I did by email that there will be an opportunity for you to raise your concerns and discussions, and we have a good shot at reaching resolution on some of these items in a way that's positive, and that we can reach an agreement on. I won't say consensus yet, because we'd like to do that next.
We'll reach consensus on some motion or other.
To empower good decision-making, and if we're not satisfied, we can table.
Okay, with that understanding, I will withdraw this motion as well,
Thank you, Joel.
pending
Yes,
fulfillment of the commitments.
you got it. Thank you for your patience as we learn to work together in a new way with new people. All right, so just so you know what, I've alluded to this before, my thinking and my contributions as chair to the agenda development is that in a newly constituted board with the responsibility of overseeing this intermunicipal insurance association that has a number of stakeholder groups and members that we care very much about and want to take good care of, and a number of objectives to address in our in alignment with our mission. And I'm not going to review the mission right now. I was going to do that in the intro. I'll find a time to make that fit. It made sense to discuss board decision-making processes as the first real order of business to facilitate hopefully decision-making as we transition through the rest of the agenda items. And Joel kindly foreshadowed thoughts about options for thinking about this in the context of the reconstituted board. And I am, others may have thought about options as well. But I'd like Joel, to give Joel the opportunity to talk about proposals for decision-making process to get us started.
Okay, I really feel apologetic about the extent to which my mouth is moving during this entire period here. Again, it will probably continue this meeting, but I hope in future meetings to be able to retreat a little bit. I think Tracy's suggesting that a motion might be in order after I make a presentation.
I am saying that that would be welcome.
All right. In the document that I distributed on November 1st to you all, I suggested that the obvious, that in a board consisting of 3 representatives of 2 different groups, that the opportunity for deadlock is staring us in the face unless we come up with an approach that is not merely so-called majority rule. And some of you will remember that I suggested that in years gone by that we adopt a consensus approach to decision-making. And not strangely, in an uneven group with either 3 or 4 out of 5 representatives on one side or the other, that was rejected. So what I suggest is that now we actually could adopt a consensus model. And then I further suggest that works. And then I looked at what the legislature did, not for this board, but for the commission that's going to be negotiating health benefits. And their decision-making mechanism will be a hybrid. And basically, it would consist of an act supported by a majority of representatives from one group, as well as a majority of votes from the representatives of the other group. There have been occasions in this room where not all of us on one side or the other have agreed with each other, and so it seemed to me that we could at least provide for that eventuality without requiring a 6-way consensus. So this would require, so the proposal is that we change, and I guess it's a motion, right, Tracy? Is that all right?
I move, yep.
So I move that we amend the manner of acting bylaw, which is Article 3, Section 8, so that it reads, instead of majority rule, that the act of majorities of the Vermont School Boards Association's appointees and of the Vermont National Education Association's appointees present at a meeting at which a quorum is present shall be the act of the directors. It's a lot of words, but arithmetically it's simple. If everybody's here, then at least 2 from each side would have to agree in order for an action to occur. If fewer than all of us are here, and there are 3 on one side and just 2 for the other, then 2 out of the 3 on the one side would have to agree, but both of the others, both from the other would have to, because 1 is not a majority of 2. That said, the third alternative is 3 on one side. There are two more options, forgive me. There's 3 on one side and just 1 on the other. Well, that 1 would have to be in agreement with at least 2 of the people on the other side for it to occur. That's how you get there. And you can, and again, if you have 2 of each at a meeting, then all 4 have to agree with each other. So those are the, I've been involved in group work like this for beyond my adult life, back in college. And frankly, as Mark knows, my college experience was at a Quaker institution, which in fact was dominated entirely by consensus decision-making. That's why I'm such a big fan of consensus decision-making. Because as hard as it is, it really works, and people really work together. When you have a board composed of 3 of each, a food group, and there are only 2 food groups, you have to come up with a mechanism, and so this is what I come up with. It's not straight consensus, but it's I guess I'd call it the majority of majorities as a way of actually getting us to make decisions rather than facing head-on. And for what it's worth, this is an unusual organization where the bylaws can be adopted, amended by the very people in the room all the time. There's no time frame. We can change the bylaws today and change them again tomorrow in case something doesn't work out.
Yeah. But do they need approval by the DFR? We can change, but
Yes.
then they need to go to the DFR.
You won't need approval. You need them. I don't want to quibble.
Okay,
But it's
I need to
more
understand
than
the
the difference
process.
between a motion and a suggestion.
Yeah, point
They don't
of order.
approve everything.
Yeah, yes.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Could you read your motion again, please?
The motion,
Yeah.
yes. And again, you'll have it.
It's the one written on your document,
It's,
I'm
it's,
correct.
basically it's motion on page 2 of the document, which is A.
Dated November 1st.
The manner of acting section. So you move,
So I move that the bylaw relating to manner of acting, that's what it's called in the bylaws, be amended to read, the act of majorities of the Vermont School Boards Association's appointees and of the Vermont National Education Association's appointees present at a meeting at which a quorum is present shall be the act of the directors.
and I will ask, is there a second for that motion?
I will second.
Thank you. Is there discussion?
Okay.
Yes, Elizabeth.
Yeah. I took a look at this and, you know, I guess a couple things. One, I think one of the, from a past discussion around consensus, one of the major hurdles that this board had in the past is I believe the past discussion included individual board member veto power, and I know that was a concern at the time. I also, which I don't think your motion is including.
It does not provide for individual veto, yes.
So just to clarify that.
Yes.
I also would, I guess I can't reinforce it enough, I do feel like it's always a goal of this board and any board I've served on to reach consensus. And, you know, I think everybody works really hard to do that. It's helped me when I've looked at tough issues in the past, or sort of what is the concern or fear of what might happen with a certain motion or configuration or process, whatever it might be. And I think, as I look at this, you know, the concern is that any substantive issue might be driven by if there was not attendance at a board meeting for whatever reason, whether schedules or whatever, by either parties, that substantive decisions could be made without deliberation or representation. So I don't know if it's appropriate, Tracy, but I did kind of tap into VSBA's resources around really thinking about what a quorum is and then how actions can be taken with a quorum. So I hope this is actually pretty consistent with what you're thinking in terms of this particular motion, but I don't know if I'd call it a friendly amendment, because I do have a couple of ideas regarding kind of quorum and knowing this was on the agenda and sort of a follow-on to quorum, which would be action of the board. And then I did copy sort of some of the guidelines that teams can use in building consensus.
May I converse a little bit here? If I understand what you just said, one of your concerns is that because of the current quorum definition, which would be 4,
Mhm.
and because somebody might not be in a meeting, and that might somehow disadvantage.
Well, it wasn't clear in the action or the proposal that couldn't be avoided. So that's where I sort of took the liberty to kind of, and again, I'm not.
I don't think we're
I'm no
talking
lawyer,
past
but-
each other, but my understanding of what I've proposed, which is what the legislature did with, we're living under that reality on the other group anyway, takes into account that notion, because without a majority of, let's just say, without a majority of school board reps in the room, if they are outnumbered by the Vermont NEA reps in the room, no decision gets made unless one or both of the school board reps in the room agrees with 2 or 3 of the Vermont NEA reps in the room.
Then,
See what I mean?
yeah, and I think the language I'm proposing, at least it was clearer to me, because if, again, the way you're explaining it, I think it would be consistent with
Okay, well, that's
what I'm
fine.
thinking about. It's just, it wasn't as clear as some of the notes I made. And I don't know if it's appropriate if I could share the copies I have.
Sure.
So I'll just pass these. I don't know if I made enough, because I did them on my home printer and it's running out of ink, but those are just some of the VSBA guidelines.
I can beat that, my printer ran out of ink.
I was gonna say, I think I've heard that a couple of times.
I feel like a student in class.
My dog ate
No
my-
compensation for board service, but maybe we ought to have ink,
And I think
ink reimbursement.
yeah, the only, so I broke this down into two thoughts, which could easily be combined in my opinion, but one is the, an idea regarding quorum, and the other is a follow-on, language regarding action of the board. I'll just pass those around. I don't think necessarily everybody can take one, but sorry about that. And I also am suggesting though that, and I think this is consistent with a statement that was just made, that this be interim. And I wasn't sure what we were hearing from Mike in terms of the specific report that might come from VFR, but I was just going to say interim until those guidelines are issued in early January, or whatever the time frame is, not knowing if there might be something specific to this area. So,
Which one should we look at?
so I would look at the draft idea regarding quorum first. And I think, Joel, this is what you were saying, but it would be on an interim basis. A quorum would consist of at least 2 board members representing school districts and at least 2 board members representing Vermont NEA. And I actually did look back at some former bylaws, which are pretty dated, but with a slight modification. This is actually consistent with some previous bylaws way before my service on this board. But that if there were less than 2 members representing either party, sorry for the, I got either party, those members would adjourn the meeting without taking up business.
Without looking at the supporting material, I understand what you're getting at, and I do think you're right to question whether it's related directly to the decision-making process. So let me say, which is not to diminish its significance. I don't have a particular problem with the suggestion that we have at least 4 people here, at least 2 on each side. That's what the input is. But there may be a time where that's not going to happen. But nevertheless, that's a separate issue from how those 4 or 5 or 6 people make a decision. And so I think that the definition of quorum is a separate issue. That doesn't mean we can't resolve them as a package.
Yeah, and it may be, but I guess it seemed to fit with your proposal here, your motion that's on the table right now.
Yeah, I confess to not having thought about that possibility, that only 1 of 3 would be able to attend a meeting, other than to think to myself in the context of the decision-making idea, well, that person has to agree with herself in order for the entire board to be able to make a decision.
As I perhaps look ahead to the
So
second
the
part,
second one, yeah, I was reading.
which is the draft follow on to quorum and its language regarding action of the board. I think that,
Oh, I see.
That does kind of address
that
the,
gets to closer to where you are and how you
Right.
balance a 3-2
how,
or a
how,
3-1.
yeah, how less than the full board could act, yeah.
And I don't know if that's comparable to what you intended to be in your motion.
Well, let me suggest that your language has the same meaning as my language, but my language isn't dependent on the definition of quorum. My concern would be that somewhere down the road, somebody says, let's change the meaning of quorum, and we're left with this language as the decision-making mechanism, although the meaning of quorum has changed. So, I mean, if there's a way of splitting this baby, I think it's by adopting your first paragraph and my language. And I think that addresses both.
Look again at your language.
And maybe we don't have to make a decision today, and we can consign this to a committee to vet it a little bit more, so long as we have an agreement about how we're gonna proceed for the balance of today.
Right, I'm looking for your language again. I wanna reread it.
My,
My piles of paper.
I understand, I got the same issue, Tracy. It really just changes the word majority to majorities in our bylaws, and then makes reference to both organizations instead of just the directors. If you all want me to read it out loud, then I'll be happy to.
So if a quorum is no less than 4 people, 2 and 2, and the manner of acting of a quorum is that a majority of the appointees of each organization must act. Does that accomplish the 2 questions that have been raised?
I'm not sure I understood what you just offered.
I just tried to restate
Oh, but you,
what I thought Elizabeth's friendly amendment might be, and whether it would interface with your motion.
my proposal changes the bylaws with specific language.
The bylaws would speak to quorum too.
This is definitely a problem of first impression. First impression being the only impression you get a chance to have before making a decision. Otherwise known as some of the problems with the open meetings law, which exists for good reasons, but it makes this sort of discussion more difficult.
Well,
I guess what I'll propose is that for tonight's purposes, since the quorum issue is irrelevant, we're all here. It's may feel presumptuous, but that we adopt for tonight the language that I proposed, and that the chair appoint a committee to thoroughly thrash this out and come back with formal language that incorporates both thoughts.
I've heard committees are hard in a board of 6. My personal preference is we agree to an interim process while the formal bylaws changes are pending with DFR. And I think we're pretty close.
I'm really sorry, I don't understand that.
Well-
There's nothing pending in front of DFR.
Maybe I still don't understand, and my question
Yeah, I just,
wasn't clear, but my understanding was that DFR needed to complete the revisions to the rules per
whatever it
I-90-1.
is.
And that, that was an important first step. Didn't preclude us from beginning to work on bylaws changes, but that piece procedurally was best finished before we come back with bylaws changes, which require DFR approval.
I
And
understand.
my hope was we could get some interim decision-making agreements that could in fact become bylaw changes that are approved by DFR. But it seems like we're still unclear about the role of DFR
Yeah, I
in bylaw
agree.
changes.
I mean, feel free to ask DFR again, but my understanding from the email exchange that Laura had in August, I think, with DFR was that DFR said, go ahead and amend your bylaws. Didn't say, go ahead and submit proposed bylaw changes to DFR for approval. I understand there is a bit of oversight that DFR has on that, and that's fine. But I just don't think that we should stymie ourselves from acting What
Do
you
you
mean
want to
not?
speak to
No, I
that, or
wouldn't
do you
want
want
clear.
Laura to speak to that?
I don't actually,
Yeah.
I don't think it's appropriate for me to engage, yeah.
So can you clarify, Laura, what your understanding of the process is for amending bylaws?
Generally, we have amended bylaws at least twice with DFR, and I have amended them several times for VISBIT, which is under the same regulation with DFR. And in both cases, we submit to Jesse, who's the other department from Anna, the licensing department.
Which is why you don't want to speak to
There
it.
is usually a conversation with what is the rationale for changing the bylaws, what's the background for changing the bylaws? And then the bylaws go into the approval process, which DFR usually takes 60 to 90 days. And then they give us approval of the bylaws, and that the bylaws are not officially in effect until they've approved. Now, they have not, other than the conversation around tell us what you're doing, or what's the rationale or the impetus for the bylaw change, so they make sure they understand them. They have approved bylaws for both organizations as presented. But we have, and it hasn't been an issue as far as we didn't have to wait or do something, it just wasn't
Well, that's the question
impactful on
now.
that.
I'm sorry, but that's the question.
Sorry, I was,
You're not finished?
I'm not finished.
Finish.
So
Sorry.
generally, that has been the process. My recollection, the reason that I showed confusion earlier, was that I recall your question at the annual meeting of Emily. Was there anything that, for this particular change in law, we initially anticipated changing the bylaws or in August and September and submitting to DFR so that the bylaws and documents were aligned with law ahead of October 1st when the law took effect. And then Emily Brown in August, I think this is the email that you might be referring to, Joel, suggested that we wait for the rule process that she thought would be in early 2019. So the board delayed any action on bylaws, didn't even really discuss it in August, but just said, I'm still not finished. At the annual
You're
meeting, when my recollection of your question to Emily was, are we limited to changing the bylaws only around Act 11? Or could we make other bylaw changes that the board wants to do that Act 11 does not contemplate or require? And Emily said you absolutely can. But regardless, we will need to submit to DFR bylaw changes. And I would, working with DFR in the past, for the last 5 years, they would prefer that we send one package and not send
Oh, sure.
multiple because of their workload. It's nice to see the whole thing at once and look at it and do one review. Now I am done.
The predominant concern I have is this, and I somehow can't believe that DFR controls the behavior of every organization that changes its bylaws by preventing those bylaws from taking effect for however long it takes DFR to approve them. I don't think that's what happens. I just want to make sure that we conform our behavior to the changes that we would like to see in the bylaws, whether they are formally in effect as far as DFR is concerned or not. Otherwise, we could spend years waiting for approval of bylaw changes.
They have
It's
90
not a
days.
comment on anybody at
Yeah.
DFR, but that sort of thing has been known to happen.
Understand and appreciate and agree with you that what we're seeking is an interim agreement, for how we operate now, understanding that we'd potentially like it to go through the DFR bylaw change process. So we can agree to work differently as those are pending. Yes.
I had a question, a clarifying question. If we propose these as interim changes, then are we going to have to do this again? Would it not make sense to make the proposals? I thought Mike was fairly clear that unless it's breaking the law, they're probably, likely, no guarantees, but likely not going to reverse us. So if we
Yeah,
could make a decision and go forward,
Yep,
We're on the same page.
We're on the same page, different
Thought so, thank you.
vocabulary.
Okay.
Let's not use the word interim.
I'm
Let's-
trying to find a word to say
I
that.
think it's, we adopt motions. And if they have the effect of changing our bylaws, then we will conform our behavior to them unless informed by the regulatory agency that we're wrong. We shouldn't
So-
wait.
Did we get a motion, or did we just talk about a motion?
No, Joel has a
Joel's
motion,
motion's
it's
on
the
the
And it's
motion
been
written on the
seconded.
paper, it's been
So-
seconded. Elizabeth has suggested some other
A
language, but there's
friendly
been no
amendment to add to that,
Can I ask a question again?
yes.
Perhaps Elizabeth, since it's Article 3, Section 7, would your language really be not a friendly amendment, but address, it's a separate amendment to the quorum section?
That's what it feels like.
Does that-
It can go either way, for me personally, and
Okay.
hopefully I'm not voting. I'd like to see that things go together, but we can take it one step at a time.
I just thought since the bylaws are written that way, addressing the quorum and
Yeah.
separately addressing the manner of acting, can we be able to do both right now and move forward?
For,
Sorry. I'll give it back to you. I'll try and
What page are you on, Peggy? Sorry.
And the bylaws at 6 of 12 on my office, so.
Tracy,
find it. Yes, sir?
for me, it's a practical question. The quorum issue is a practical question. Are there circumstances under which we would have an agenda that is frankly non-controversial in nature, where 3 members of the School Boards Association's appointees can be present, but only 1 person from Vermont EA can be present? That would adoption of this, of Elizabeth's approach here would foreclose us having that meeting about non-controversial items.
If that-
It's purely practical.
Yeah, just that, if that meeting happened and it was 3-1 on an item, would on a motion, would the motion pass?
But the answer unfortunately is it depends. If the 1 vote is on the side with the 3 representatives, then it would pass.
Correct.
But if the 1 vote were the singular member of the 1-person delegation, no, it would not.
It depends is a good answer.
It's the right answer in almost every question.
It is, I use all of them. Laura?
So regardless of what the board decides on how to handle manner of acting, there will be times that we will need to be guaranteed a decision at a meeting, because there'll be a deadline. Usually it's the
Pressure's
rate,
on,
right? That's the biggest deadline that we have. But there may be other times that we will have to have a decision in a particular timely fashion. So I just wanted the board to think about or contemplate, how are you going to be guaranteed to reach a decision if one needs to be made? You just stay here until you get to that point that 4 people are comfortable.
In my favorite world, all those questions get resolved before the meeting by the staff. And the delegations are sufficiently brought up to speed so that there won't be particular controversy around this head in the best of all worlds. And that is how we functioned for decades.
A different way of thinking of the board responsibility than I have. There are
So
times there are hard
I'll take that as a
decisions
put down, but I don't care.
No, there are times there are hard decisions, and it might be inappropriate for those to be made,
Of course,
other than in a public meeting of the board.
perfectly true. And the
That
decision-
there's more than one right way to go, and it's tough, and that decision really shouldn't be made at that.
You
at a
wouldn't,
different
staff
level.
wouldn't make decisions. They would resolve the great,
Well, that's making decisions.
well, anyhow, you've made your point, I've
Yeah.
made mine. Okay.
So,
Tracy,
Elizabeth?
Just a quick, I think what I envisioned when I was looking over your information, and kind of what I put together was that notion of how does this allow the newly configured board to get work done, but also to ultimately present a package of bylaw changes to DFR. And so I appreciate your comment, Peggy, about would we revisiting it, to the extent that revisiting sort of affirms, hey, this work has been working well, and we want to now institute it into bylaws, or, you know what, we discovered some tweaks where we need to modify it before it went into a bylaw. I think that's probably a level of concern I have, Joel, is before we memorialize it in a bylaw, because it is new, and frankly, I still struggle with the notion that my representation, at least for the next day, is more limited to school districts, because I know, I have to say honestly, you know, based on the mission of VEHI, we serve a common member, and that's a little bit of a struggle. So I think what I had proposed is this allows us to get work done now, and whether it's memorialized or not.
The logical box I think we're in is this. Unless we change the bylaws, they're the bylaws. And the bylaws control policy. And what we're talking about here is adopting on an interim basis something that would be called a policy. It's the policy of this board to make its decisions in accordance with a majority of majorities or something like that, where the bylaws still are the controlling document. That's the problem. And we can do it as long as the world at large doesn't mind our functioning that way. But as a formal basis, we'd be out of compliance with our bylaws.
Can you just explain again the 3-to-1 vote process again? I just want to understand what you're saying.
The people in the room are three
for
Monty
one.
and you,
Okay.
from school boards. And your question is, how does a decision get made? And in short form, if you don't like the proposal, it won't get adopted.
Okay, so
And
the one
on the
could
other
vote
side,
against the three.
Either 2 or 3 of Vermont EA's folks would have to agree to adopt it.
You have to side with you.
And if you agree to it.
So so it still could be 3-to-1.
The vote
Yes,
most likely.
it could be.
But would not carry.
But the one delegate in attendance for the school boards basically holds the cards.
Because the one could say no, even though the
And
3
then
said
the
yes.
3 can say yes.
But if you can convince 2 of us to join you, then it's 3-to-1, but it carries.
It's a majority of majorities present.
Just in my mind trying to wrap that around.
And
You're too used to dealing with numbers in the
Yes.
hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is really single digits below 4.
I really think everybody wants to accomplish the same thing.
Yeah.
That's my sense. I'm
Yeah.
just figuring out, I'm just processing how best to communicate that in words.
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
Peggy raised the issue about the quorum language coming later in where it is currently, where it currently resides, if you will. Is there any, I don't understand quite what the problem was, what that is. I don't understand why these two things have to be conjoined, I guess is another way of putting it, when we've got a section on quorum in the bylaws.
Well, practically speaking, I wouldn't support a motion independent of an agreement that the second, motion would carry, for instance. But I have to say, I do struggle with the potentiality. I mean, if the goal is to have some representation from both parties, I do struggle with the potentiality that 3-to-1 could exist. And I worry that,
Around the table, I mean.
right.
Even though it's sort of
Yeah,
the domination issue.
Well, I'm concerned that it puts, whoever the single representative is in the position of, without conference with
Without having
the other
somebody
party,
Well, if it'll help, I understand. I sort of don't mind either approach, but if it'll advance this, then I think I will accept as a friendly amendment the addition of a change in the bylaw regarding quorum to reflect the concern Elizabeth has presented. There's no bylaw wording that we can adopt on it, and so we have to, we're not gonna do that here, but we can we can craft that, as they say,
What?
before the next meeting.
A quorum for the transaction of business at any meeting of the VEHI board shall consist of at least two representatives, board members representing school districts, and at least two board members representing Vermont NEA.
Yeah, I think, at some point, we're gonna have to use the same kind of language when we describe us. Laura tried Group A and Group B, and I don't like that,
Yeah.
but that's historical, that's.
Well, then it goes on to say, if less than two board members
So what I've
present.
used, Tracy, what I've used is a reference to the Vermont School Boards Association appointees and Vermont National Education Association appointees. I don't know if it's better or worse, but that's what I did.
Joel, and I'm asking you this sort of as a, with your attorney mind, the law,
An old attorney.
An old
There's
attorney.
a difference.
the law doesn't say VSBA and Vermont NEA. It uses the largest, right, which is even more awkward, okay? But my concern is, do you think that DFR will consider using specific names in the bylaws as sort of
That's probably not a
overreaching for the law?
No, I guess, I
Appointing
don't think, if I were, if I were a regulator, I'd say, oh, that reflects the present reality.
It does
If
reflect
the
the present
reality
reality.
changes,
You could
then
change
they'll
it.
change the bylaws.
I wondered that too, but I didn't know whether we wanted, like, appointing
Just say
organizations, and then
appointing
you don't have,
organizations.
it's less words, each appointing organization.
You know, I don't often pull this card, but as some of you know, I was a commissioner in state government, and I was just a person. You know, those are just plain folks doing their job. I don't think we should be running so overtly concerned about what they might or might not do. The worst that'll happen is they'll say, in reviewing the law, we didn't find this bylaw consistent with it, so we want you to change it. That's nothing more than that's ever gonna happen. So I think we should just use our best judgment and run with it.
But this also is a document that will be used by future boards too.
Yes, absolutely. Anyhow, Tracy, the general wording you came up with is fine, it's fine with me.
This phrase from Elizabeth.
So from the minutes perspective,
It's a friendly amendment.
Friendly amendment. I make
so
a
we,
second to that friendly amendment. Do I have to second that?
Now, if Joel accepts it, we're
Oh,
good.
okay.
so we've amended the motion to add additional language around the quorum. And that language is what Elizabeth proposed,
That underlined part.
underlined part, not
Uh-oh.
starting with, so not with an interim basis,
Not
but
just
starting with a quorum.
of a meeting of the VEHI board shall consist of at least
Okay, a
two
meeting
board
of the,
members.
right.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, are we on the quorum or the follow-on to the quorum? The
So
quorum.
we're adding, so what I'm hearing again as the minute taker is that we've amended Joel's motion, so now the motion amends two parts of the bylaws.
Want me to try and read it?
No, I still don't, I'm not sure if I'm clear about whether, and I hear what you're saying, Joel, if you don't amend the bylaws, then you aren't, then the bylaws still trump, right? So I get that, that makes sense. So we're amending the bylaws knowing that before you submit them to DFR, if the next meeting you decide that you wanna tweak it, you could change it again.
And
So that we get one full
one
package to
full
DFR.
package to DFR.
So the motion would be changing both the quorum as Elizabeth has proposed and changing the manner of acting as Joel has proposed. That's the current motion. It was seconded by Fran and you accept the friendly amendment. Just wanna make sure that's where we are.
That's all right, as long as mine comes first and hers is a friendly amendment.
Yes.
So it
That's how it
would
works.
change first that, then it would add it instead of
As a-
introducing.
as-
Yeah,
as a-
yep,
as a
I would
friendly
help that.
amendment.
And would you
And-
like me to read what I think it
Please.
says?
I would, but the caveat that I have still is, when we look at the bylaws themselves, you know, the precise wording, well, we can change it again. I retreat, I'm sorry.
So
Peggy,
before I
what
I
read,
didn't need to hear it all.
before I read the whole amendment, or motion with the friendly amendment, would like to ask that after that, the notes reflect that we're committed to operating consistent with that, pending the completion of the complete bylaw review and approval of DFR. So that we've said to anybody who reads our minutes, this is how we're rolling until we tell you otherwise, or we're told we can't operate that way. And that will also, I think, help to answer your question about how we operate in the process.
That's fine, but I may not have heard you correctly. Did you use the word pending?
Yeah, we're gonna say it
That's
again.
not
Don't
the
say
right word.
pending then.
That's
Say
the
it
wrong
again,
word.
what do you, because I haven't
The-
written it down.
You can make some general reference to DFR.
We
We don't need to
we-
refer to DFR.
well,
But you want to.
In anticipation.
well, unless I get more clear information that says we don't need to, it's my understanding that we do. So you and I have a difference of an opinion on that. So we'll figure that out between now and the next meeting, and in the meantime, let's be prepared for either eventuality. Okay? And we are committed to operating using these manner of
We're amending the bylaws, are we not? We're amending the
and
bylaws.
we're gonna live by them unless and until we decide not to.
In anticipation of.
We're amending the.
In
Final
anticipation.
Yeah, in anticipation of,
DFR review.
yeah, and,
DFR review.
yep, all right.
No, I mean, it's a disagreement, and maybe I'm wrong. I could be, this happens, it happens a lot.
And I could be,
But it might be pending disapproval. I don't know that DFR's role sees itself as approving every jot and
So
tittle
we say
in every
DFR
bylaw
review.
of every insurance company. It doesn't happen that way. It's just.
But we're regulated by DFR, so, and, I mean, Mike just specifically reviewed
There's
the
a difference
bylaws.
between being regulated and being subject to the approval of for everything we do.
yeah.
Okay.
And so,
Changes to, I'm trying to look at our
Mike
rules.
said approve, but I don't know if
Sweet.
he- but he did say so. Mike said approve, but I don't know if he-
They shall be approved or disapproved by the commissioner within a 45-day period.
Maybe.
so, at least that's the information that Laura has at this time.
All right, but so-
Let's be prepared for any eventuality, and we'll get a clear direction on that for the
So
future.
the import is we are changing our bylaws with a recognition that it's possible that the state may disagree.
Yes.
Okay. As long as we're amending the
Yeah.
bylaws.
So, here's my take at restating
The vote.
the motion and the friendly amendment. Joel moved and Fran seconded that bylaws related to the manner of acting be amended to read that the act of majorities of the Vermont School Boards Association's appointees and of the Vermont National Education Association's appointees present at a meeting at which a quorum is present shall be the act of the directors.
That's fine. I think you might want to reference the fact that it's Article 3, Section 8.
Yeah,
You did?
okay.
Okay.
I'm sure I said that. I'm teasing
You may be
you.
sure,
I
but you
didn't say,
didn't.
I didn't say it.
You were thinking.
But Laura,
That's called cleaning up the minutes, yeah.
Laura will make sure I said that.
All
And
right, now I understand
There-
what you mean, okay.
is a friendly amendment that is an addition to that further provides that an amendment to the section of the bylaws, which Laura will cite the numbers related to the definition of a quorum, and it will say, a quorum for the transaction of business at any meeting of the VEHI board shall consist of at least 2 board members representing school districts and at least 2 board members representing Vermont NEA. Is there any further discussion of the motion and its friendly amendment? Elizabeth?
Yes, the devil's in the detail. What is the acceptable language on being present at a meeting as it relates to electronic participation?
Electronic participation is possible. If it's all electronic, if we have a completely remote meeting, which we'll talk about
We have done that.
someday, and we've done that, there's some additional fun with making it available online, but the rules of present quorum and all of that will still apply. Okay? Any other discussion or questions? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Congratulations, you have your first decision as a newly configured board.
Can I say one comment, just to sort of get people familiar with the minutes and the bylaws? So when we do that, the minutes will just say the motion passed. If you want the motion to say your particular vote for any reason, you need to say that, and then it will do so, but otherwise it just says passed or failed. It doesn't say vote how many goes what way or anything like that unless you call for it. And that the bylaws also show a presumption of assent, so that unless you are clear and correct the record that's in your minutes, that you will be presumed to have agreed with whatever motion of the board is there. So it's just good to know what your responsibilities are as new members, and if you want to go on record or you want to change something, just look at the bylaws on how you do that.
I want to keep our track record of successfully taking action, speeding along, and take up the minutes, and then let's take a quick break. Our dinner is out there, and grab dinner and come back to business. So the next item of business is approval of the minutes of September 10th and October 19th, 2018. You got those minutes in advance, and I presume have had an opportunity to review them. I understand that not everybody was present, but you're all welcome to review and ask questions. Are there any amendments or questions or discussion about the minutes? Joel? Oh, well, you're right, I should get a motion first, sorry.
Make a motion to approve the minutes of the September 10th and October 19th board meetings.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
I need you to.
Yeah.
Now, discussion, amendments,
Thank you. Just one concern. The minutes are provide an abbreviated reference to the purpose behind the proposals that the minutes refer to. And the minutes are limited in their reference to equality in decision making, if I don't have it in front of me, but it's limited to decision making. And in fact, the reasons that the three of us from the non-EA's side of the equation made they submitted the list of issues was, as it says in that document, for the purpose of ensuring that the board acknowledges in its structure and conduct the equal role of each delegation. And for what it's worth, structure and conduct go well beyond decision making, which is, that's what we just did. We talked about decision making. It's all well and good, but there are other issues which call for a true level of what it means to be a partnership. And those are the issues to come. Not a big deal, but I would like the minutes to reflect the broader purpose than merely decision making of the notion of providing equal representation.
do you have your minutes in front of you?
I do not.
I'm still looking through my file for mine, so I'm looking for a specific.
They're in your packet, there's a, you're looking, I assume, at the October 19th minutes.
Correct. Correct, and there's the reference is under the
Distribution of
page
material.
paragraph of distribution of materials, and it says, once again, that Cook spoke on behalf of Vermont EA appointees and indicated that they have a series of proposals to present to the board, and then it says merely is my word, to establish equality of decision making. And all I'm suggesting is that what we said went beyond equality in decision making, but encompassed the structure and conduct of the VEHI board.
Encompass say that again.
Structure and conduct.
Structure and conduct, so.
Of the VEHI board.
Yeah, and Tracy,
Elizabeth?
yeah, I appreciate that was the intent of the, issues that were brought up and kind of asked to review. I still would say, that the goal of this body in both individually and in acting as a body is in the shared service to its members. So the notion of equality in decision-making, to me, is is subservient to serving our members.
In broad strokes, I don't disagree, but that's not what this discussion is about. This discussion is about what we said was the purpose of the proposal we gave you on October 19th. That's what, it wasn't a judgment about whether we should do something or not. It's what we had in mind and what we said we had in mind.
And so you'd like to add to that statement, and structure and conduct of the board.
Okay.
And your document's attached as well, so.
The proposal itself.
Yeah.
Okay, to establish equality in decision-making, you're not saying you want to strike any of those words. And then say and encompass?
And structure and conduct of the board.
You know, I really don't want to make it look more than it is. There's a simple sentence in the paper that we gave, and it says.
Okay, tell me which simple sentence, because it's
I
hard
will,
to
I'm
put,
about to, and it's the middle of the first paragraph
of the which document?
of the October 19th document.
Yeah, but there were two of them, which October 19th document?
Along
The one
with
with the
not the
board?
statement
List
to the
of
members,
matters.
but the list of issues.
Just want to make sure I'm on the
List of
same page,
matters.
yeah?
Those are matters.
And it's contained in that sentence midway through the first paragraph. The singular theme underlying each proposal is to ensure a board with equal representation acknowledges in its structure and conduct the equal role of each delegation. I'm sorry to take so much time up on
It's
this, but
important. These things matter. Any other discussion of minutes?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to be done here, Joel, because I don't want you to be upset how I do it again. So then the minutes, so I'm hearing consensus that the minutes are amended. I'm not hearing any, it's just a matter of the words.
Right.
And the minutes will reflect that they're amended when you vote. You'll be
I would
voting on
say-
the amendment.
I
But
would-
the board, present to the board to acknowledge its structure and conduct, in its structure and conduct, the equal role of each delegation?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
Any other questions, issues, adjustments to minutes? So we are voting to approve the minutes as amended. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Thank you very much. Let's get food and do our best to work while we eat, given the time constraints. And we will pause for chewing and swallowing at any point someone needs or wants to speak, but needs a moment to be ready. The next item of business is the completion of conflict of interest statements. It is in this place in the agenda because it is part of the annual board reorganization work. And in this particular case, we have 3, soon to be 4 members who have not signed a conflict of interest statement. I actually have the statements here, and note that the commissioner noticed that. And so typically at our annual meeting, we distribute these, ask folks to acknowledge any conflicts of interest and sign off on them and hand them back to Laura. Elizabeth, you should probably re-sign and we'll redo it with a new board member when we have that new board member. I want to acknowledge that there's been preliminary research and some communications by emails and other venues about how we grapple with the way that policies, bylaws, and the current conflict of interest statement play out in the context of the newly configured board. And it is work that we should do, that we should undertake as a board over time to review and revise policies and bylaws as appropriate and have a conversation about conflicts of interest in general. That said, in the name of continuing organizational opportunities with integrity. Ask that people do sign those conflict of interest statements tonight. Acknowledging that the key area of discussion is the extent to which a member of an organization that is also a contracted service provider for VEHI is likely to have a conflict of interest unless and until we change policies and have had an opportunity to have full discussions about how we move forward to navigate that circumstance that I'm sure was not anticipated specifically in the context of board reconfiguration. So I will pass out the conflict of interest forms, and as I do that, look to Joel across the table, who I know would like to speak to this as well.
I move that we delay consideration, the completion of the disclosure forms until such time as we've been able to assess to our collective satisfaction the meaning of conflict of interest.
Is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Peggy, yes. Is there discussion?
My purpose is multiple, actually. Well, my purpose is this. I don't know what a conflict of interest is in this room. I think I actually do, but I don't think we do as a group. There is a analysis that Laura committed us to in August that, in my view, reaches incorrect conclusions about the nature and extent and import of any impact of board decisions on Vermont EA dues that would theoretically, in their view, confer a conflict of interest on Vermont EA appointees who are members of Vermont EA. There is, in my memory, no time that this board ever considered the array of potential conflicts of interest that this board actually has, including, as those of you who have read my memo on this know, including the role of the president. So anyhow, I will not fill out this form because I don't know what a conflict of interest is, and I don't think anybody in the room does. And until we decide what a conflict of interest means, we can't fill this document out anymore. Until this year, it was routine for all of us just to put the word no at the direction of Laura or Joe Zimmerman before her on the lines there and sign it, and that was fine. But we got this analysis that I find just
Is there any?
really, frankly, wrong in so many ways that I just will not participate in this tonight myself. And I think that as a board, we should defer this. The bylaws, or again, the policy, one or the other, requires us to do this on an annual basis, and I have absolutely no question about the legitimacy of doing that, but there's no obligation for us to do it on any particular day.
Any other discussion? Elizabeth?
You know, I do think, first of all, I think it is defined on the document itself, and I know the amount of time that was invested in reviewing this and seeking out professional input to put this in. You know, it certainly can be added to a future agenda for review, and I think there's a mechanism not to sign it. I mean, I don't think anyone's forcing it.
You're right, there is what purports to be a definition of conflict of interest here, but that's not our conflict of interest definition. That's a statement, those are words that appear on this document. They may appear in our conflict of interest policy, but our conflict of interest policy is inconsistent with the superior words in our bylaws. Our bylaws contain the current definition of, the current controlling definition of conflict of interest, and it is different from what's stated here.
And this is the policy that was, or the statement that was adopted by the board, and
In
language.
variance from the bylaws definition,
and
which was adopted by this board and which has priority.
and that
Yeah.
hasn't been brought up. as a-
Clarifying,
Well, I know- Elizabeth, I know it hasn't been brought up, that's why I'm bringing it up.
so, a couple clarifications from my perspective. We do have a conflict of interest policy that I believe was encouraged by DFR, which enumerates the implementation of the policy and the definitions of a conflict of interest. And that was adopted April 9th, 2008. I also, my recollection, and I'm sure there's records to the fact that historically, appointees to the board who were employed by Vermont NEA, including you, included that as an area of conflict of interest. And I'm pretty sure we could find historical
Good luck.
statements that say that.
All of them?
That said, I would welcome further discussion on the motion.
I know, but not all of them.
No, since 2013.
We have a motion to, what was your word, defer,
I
table,
think it was
delay?
Delay.
Delay?
Delay completion of the conflict of interest disclosure statement until such time as the board
Okay.
has reviewed and reconsidered the meaning of the term conflict of interest.
Okay.
Because I don't know what one is,
Um,
even under the current policy, I don't know what it is.
So clearly, study of that should be on a future agenda. Any other discussion?
So if we do, excuse me, if we do approve that motion, does that stop me from handing mine in now?
No, as a matter of fact, I could amend the motion and just say, for anyone on the board who is not sufficiently convinced about whether he or she, I mean, he has a conflict of interest, may submit the completed statement at a later date. But ultimately, obviously, what I'm interested in is the board thoroughly vetting the issue.
I think thorough vetting is appropriate, but I also would like the minutes to show that I feel strongly that a commitment to following the conflict of interest policy as it is written, to the best of your ability, and doing so by signing the agreement, understanding that we are committed to further review, is a fundamental representation of the duties of individual board members that were just outlined by the president of, or the chair of DFR. That said, I'm happy to entertain a vote on the motion that's on the table.
I think the motion is variable right now. I'm willing to amend it and suggest that not anybody who is not sufficiently convinced that he or she does or does not have a conflict of interest should refrain from completing the disclosure statement at this meeting.
Duly noted.
Duly noted, that's a motion.
I understood,
Oh,
and
okay.
I've heard your
Oh, all
rationale.
right.
Can I ask for clarification, maybe from newer members, Fran or Peggy? Does the language on the statement that you're being asked to sign, is that clear from your perspective?
What bothers me is, and that's where I think it needs to be, is sort of, kind of pulling out that as a Vermont NEA member who pays dues, that somehow this would create a conflict of interest, because that would then contradict the whole legislative act about allowing anybody representing Vermont NEA to be even on this board.
So,
And that bothers me, that there would be this interpretation, because I mean, the way I read it, So yeah, I'm,
So here's the.
I mean, if I sign this, are they gonna tell me that I can no longer be a member of the Vermont NEA, I can no longer pay dues?
No,
If I pay my dues, am I in violation of the conflict of interest?
here's the section of policy, just so you know.
By the way, if the answer is no, then there's no problem.
The section of policy that's of note is bullet number 8 of the VEHI Board Conflict of Interest Policy, which says, any organization with a designated seat on the VEHI Board that is also receiving financial compensation under contract with VEHI shall represent their organization in any discussion of the organization's contract and shall abstain from making any motion or voting on their organization's contract as a member of the VEHI Board. In my experience, the one time that situation comes into play, there could be others, but the primary time that comes into play is around renewal of the contract with Vermont NEA for services on behalf of VEHI. And the conflict of interest that is worth considering noting on your conflict of interest disclosure statement is membership in Vermont NEA, as it is relevant to that particular component of our policy.
That's the point of my motion.
Recognizing that that issue will not come before us till April at the earliest, and we have a commitment to further making sure that everyone fully understands and agrees on what conflict of interest means in our context and how we manage that.
I guess from my perspective, just to share, I would not feel comfortable signing it for exactly what you explained, Tracy, and I thank you for saying it the way that you did. I think I'm here to vote and to make that, to cast that vote, including Vermont NEA in the contract. If I'm supposed to be here representing everybody, as Mike Pichek spoke to, that we're all representing all of our constituents or members, however you want to phrase it, then I need to be able to make that vote. So I think things would need to change in the language before I can sign this.
I'd like to suggest that that provision, and if you've read my memo on this subject, you know how I feel about the wording of that provision. That provision is a perfect example of why Act 11 was necessary. That provision was not adopted by any member of Vermont NEA. No one at Vermont NEA, to my knowledge, agreed with that provision. And there may ultimately have been a vote, in sort of a unanimous vote in favor of the overall policy. I don't know that. But I know, as sure as I'm sitting here, that nobody agreed with paragraph 8 of the implementation section.
Recollection, we can review the minutes, is that Jeff made the motion on that policy.
That's what I just said, on the policy. That said, it remains a perfect example of why Act 11 was necessary. That provision has no basis for being in a conflict of interest policy in the context of a bylaw provision that plainly defines out of a conflict of interest that very provision. We have to deal with this issue in a significantly detailed fashion. The memo from the law firm is flat out biased, and as is my memo in response. But my memo in response leads me to the conclusion that there is no conflict of interest on the part of Vermont NEA members participating in the decision about the service agreement between us and Vermont NEA.
Okay.
My position, however, is that there may be a significant conflict of interest in any number of other ways by some other members of this board in dealing with other service agreements. We have to deal with this issue in a reasoned and detailed fashion before anybody is required to complete that form. Finally, as you just said, we don't face an issue involving this particular problem until about April. Certainly we can resolve this before then. And so I will move that.
You already did.
I will move additionally, well, I've moved what I've moved, and that will stand, but I'm more than willing to consign this issue to a committee, because we have got to have some out of
Can
meeting
we take
time
the-
for this issue to be
Can we
considered.
take the first motion first?
Fine.
So
I'm
then,
not sure what the motion
gonna
is.
try
You
to-
I know, I
changed
said,
it.
I said it 4 different ways.
yeah, let me try and say what I think it is, and you tell me if it's right or wrong. You move to delay completion of conflict of interest statements until such time as the board has done a full review of the conflict of interest policy and had a thorough discussion of the implications of such policy, and that was seconded by.
Me.
Okay.
That's fine.
Is there any other discussion on that? All those in favor, please say aye. Opposed?
Nay?
Okay. So we will table conflict of interest.
That's fine, and
I'm
let me point,
confused.
thank you.
I'm confused whether the motion has passed or not and what you mean by table.
We have delayed, the
The
majority
motion passed.
agreed
according
to delay signing of the conflict of interest
Why?
policy. Martha and,
But we need 2 of the 3 people to vote.
oh,
Aaron,
Sorry.
immediately, yep.
And so without your vote, I don't know how the motion has gone live for the minutes, because we just changed how we act.
That's right.
thank you, sorry. I'm gonna have to think hard about that as long as I continue as chair.
That's why it's important not to do it tonight.
We have a question from the
Maybe, can I ask a question?
You may.
Looking ahead, because I think, back to what Commissioner Pichek said, the issue for most organizations is not actual conflict of interest, perception of conflict of interest. And that's a very insidious thing when people try to judge perceptions of others. So beyond the merits of whatever the memo or your memo which you wrote, Joel, I guess the question is, could you envisage a situation where there is an external body that the questions that are raised we refer to not a law firm, but say if there was an external, a third party that would be acceptable, that their ruling would move the conversation forward? Because again, my concern is back to the Commissioner's point about the perception of conflict of interest. If the good housekeeping seal would be that this acceptable body, not in a particular law firm, which, as you say, yes, there's a diversity of opinions.
The perception issue was taken up in the memo that I wrote. So you might want to, if you get a chance to read what I wrote, in addition to what the law firm in Albany, New York wrote, that would probably help. I think the analysis is the same. Whether there's a conflict, a perceived conflict, or an actual conflict, it's the same. That is to say, somebody's going to make a decision that there is or is not a noun that follows there. But that's the first question. The secondary question is, what do you do about it? What, it's not automatic. And people think it's automatic. If the commissioner implied it was automatic, you have to withdraw. But that's not the case. It's just not the case. And our bylaws make plain that
I
it's
wasn't
not the
going to
case.
that question. I was saying, with regard to resolving, I believe you raised, do you envisage a situation where the question is referred to a third party that is acceptable?
It's
And you
possible,
can,
but we're way ahead of, we're way early in that
yeah,
process.
no, I said looking ahead.
Conceptually, down the road, it may make sense for us to confer with a third party. Yes.
So I need to bring us back to the motion, and I need to cast my vote as I learn the new, and get used to the new, methods of acting. And, my vote is going to be no. So I would invite folks to sign the conflict of interest statement. If folks are unwilling to do so, I'd ask that the minutes show that they did not do so. And the minutes also show that we would like to include in the work plan for the board for the upcoming year. Further review of the statement, the policy, and any bylaws relevant, as well as to conflict of interest, as well as board education on that subject.
I'd suggest, there's no motion there, but I suggest two modifications to that. The first is that the minutes reflect that anyone declining to fill the form out now is declining to do so pending the outcome of that consideration of the meeting of conflict of interest. The second one would be that the board commit itself to resolving this issue in anticipation of consideration of service agreements, plural.
So it seems odd to me that you are making a statement for the minutes of, that, about what people's intent other than your own. So why don't you
Well,
just
No,
make your own?
Well, I'm doing no more than what the chair did. I'm suggesting that the minutes reflect more accurately what's going on here. And that is that anybody not filling out the form doesn't feel comfortable at this stage in filling out the form
And they
because.
could put that on the
I was
form
gonna
and
say,
submit it, and then they
put it on
have
your
their
form.
intent in the record, represented by themselves.
I would ask that it be submitted into the minutes as
But
well.
I mean, you could put your reason on the form of what your intent is, why you're not filling it out at this time, and then have that in the record, or I can have a comment from every person who doesn't fill it out. But I don't feel comfortable one person representing the intent of anyone other than themselves.
Which is why I just said it is also my intent to not sign this until there's clarity around these issues. I think, aren't you asking me to sign this showing that I'm in agreement with it? So why would I write a statement on here saying, if I'm not in agreement with it, I'm not gonna sign it?
You're not in agreement with the statement of declaring?
You know,
It's
I haven't made my point fully or directly. Other people in this room on the board and not on this board may themselves have a conflict of interest and not be aware of it because of the manner in which we're discussing the issue inadequately. That includes you, and it includes everyone else, including Laura and the trust administrators.
To be clear, Laura and the trust administrators are not on the board and are not
No,
asked to
I
sign.
understand that. Understand this, though, they all used to be. And the fact that they used to be is the explanation for why they're not addressed by the current policy. They should be.
Thanks for sharing your
And
concerns.
that's the subject of one of the motions that I have introduced. Oh, I'm supposed to introduce motions. You didn't remind me. I hereby present and will.
Okay, I'm lost with, on the minutes, we have a motion that failed,
I'm way down.
we have Tracy's comment that the commitment to follow the conflict of interest policy is currently written and complete the conflict of interest statement as part of their duty of, I think it's the loyalty one, but I have to check, as outlined by the commissioner. You wanted that reflected, and Joel wanted reflected that he is declining to
Sign.
sign until the policy is reviewed, and so is Peggy.
And so am I, and I'll write that on here, that
Bring it
won't
in.
sign it.
That's fine. Thank you.
And maybe I'll be found out to be wrong about this months from now. But each member of this board may very well have a conflict of interest, not dissimilar from what's being talked about with respect to Vermont EA service agreement. So you're all filling it out, assuming there is no such thing. I wouldn't do it.
All right, it is 6:35. Going to jump to,
Before you jump, and I know you want, I want to move on too, but what are we gonna do? Are we not gonna have a committee? Are we gonna let this thing wait for another 4 or 5 months before we even touch it again? I propose, and therefore move, that we establish a committee consisting of one or more members of the board and one or more members of the staff to do a thorough analysis from the board's perspective of the conflict of interest issue.
Is there a second for that?
Second.
It's been moved and
I'm
seconded.
sorry, who seconded it?
Me.
Brian.
Okay, sorry,
Um,
I'm trying to keep up.
That we form a committee for the purposes of studying further the VEHI board conflict of interest policy, form, and bylaws implications. Is there discussion on that?
Tracy, again, from my perspective, it's not uncommon at the school board level under policy governance, when we're reviewing policy, that we have situations where we might be out of compliance with policy, for instance. And in this particular case, what I hear you, Joel, saying is that bylaws are not consistent with the professional opinion we got on this disclosure
The
statement.
opposite, I'm saying the policy is not consistent with the bylaws.
Yep, well, either way,
It's
there's
different-
inconsistency.
Different meaning.
But that being said, what typically happens is within the annual review of the policy, then it becomes the opportunity to correct those issues, but based on what the requirement is under policy governance, you sort of move that forward with the intent to, review whatever the conflict is that you're highlighting. But that's your assessment of the conflict right now. So I know, again, the amount of work and discussion that went into this COI
I missed it all.
in the beginning, and
It's a lot of work.
it
I put in my share of
consistent
work on the issue.
with some of your earlier comments about, in many cases, the board takes the recommendations of staff. And this was a much more robust discussion, so I would look at it following that same process of
I don't
something's
doubt-
been identified for a future agenda.
I don't doubt it was a robust conversation, but I will tell you that it was quite incomplete.
Sure, we're focused on the motion to form a committee.
Right, and my concern is that this needs to, I wasn't here for the discussion that got us there. What bothers me is that you've got 3 people on this board who are not gonna sign the conflict of interest, and it would seem to me that all members would not be happy with that situation. And so the faster we can move this issue back up
Yeah.
to the front of the line, to be reviewed and to come in with a more reasonable and definition of conflict of interest and how it applies to any of the, whatever we do here, the service contracts, the better it'll be, because,
Yeah.
we're trying to rebuild this group to be more responsive to folks, and we really don't want this hanging over us, the fact that 3 people aren't gonna sign in protest to the way that it's defined right now.
My comment on the motion aligns with that somewhat, and I personally, if I need to vote, will not be supportive of a committee process because I think it's important for the full board to have a conversation and be able to engage in the educational process that goes with that conversation. Is there any other discussion on the motion to form a committee?
I agree with the chair to the extent that we are assured that there will be multiple occasions for that discussion prior to April. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I still think a committee would make a lot of sense too.
Motion's out there, any other discussion? All those in favor of forming a committee, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
So that motion does not carry. However, we have already stated in the minutes our commitment to doing that and can look forward to that. All right, I want to discuss in 20 minutes, and maybe Laura and trust administrators, you can help me with the true shortest duration for an update on the management stuff. So that, and actually, let's reverse the time, let's do those,
Financials,
all right.
more important.
Financials is more important, so we're gonna look at the financials and then we're gonna talk about scheduling some meetings. Ideally, in the ideal world, we would have had the work plan conversation, and we would have had a clearer picture of all of the work we needed to do, which would have informed our board meeting schedule. So we're still scheduling a little blindly but clearly we have a lot of work we wanna do, so. That's why the order of that agenda was that way. When we knew our work plan, we would be able to define our work schedule. We'll just keep doing our best until it's all clear.
There are 2 things we have to do before we leave, and that's address the agenda protocol and the
Yeah.
scheduling.
Do we have enough? Is there enough for Robert?
Oh, I think so.
There's still one more. So there's,
He's good with numbers. He
we've
can
given you
visualize.
financial statements, I think twice electronically, since October 1st. We held the October until this meeting so we could talk in person, and you now have the October and November statements. So if you look, this gives our whole program in the health and the dental, and I can help you read it. But just sort of the point right now is if you look at the November 30th column, health, the very first column on what should be the top page, you go way down to the bottom, it shows in parentheses $7.6 million. So as of right now, we are projected to spend $7.6 million of our health reserve this year towards our program. When we set the rates, we actually expected that to be about 8 million. And then when we reviewed it again this year, we expected it to be only 6.8 million. So it's currently running more than we expected. If you go back to October, you can see that in October, we were about 6.9 million, which is actually very close to what we were projecting to end the year when we re-looked at our rates with the actuaries this August. I want to point something out on October and then give a context statement. On the October, while you're there, I just want to point out in the middle of the page in operating expenses, there's 2 lines for VISBIT admin. One is called prior period, and you'll see a reduction. Overall, it's about $36,000 between health and dental. VISBIT has made a commitment not to make any kind of profit on the service agreement. So when we did the end of year true-up, we had some staffing changes, so we returned some money to you. I just wanted you to be aware of that. But when you look back at the 7.6 million that we are currently show that we're going to use towards our reserves, which is greater than expected, the actuaries at Blue Cross, who we've talked to multiple times and DFR has talked to as well, thinks that this is due to the seasonality of our health plans, that our fiscal year starts in July, when more people have met their out-of-pocket costs and the plan has more responsibility for claims. And that starting in January, we're gonna see these numbers turn. December is probably gonna look worse, so we're not to be alarmed by seeing when you get the December statement in January, that number's probably gonna go over 8 million. But that's again because in December, VEHI tends to pay a greater percent of the claims. Once we get to January, we're gonna see our responsibility decline as the out-of-pocket cost. And when I talk about out-of-pocket, I'm blind to the fact whether there's an HSA, an HRA, or FSA, or people using cash or credit cards. It's just the amount of money that is not paid by VEHI on the claims. We're gonna see favorable, from our point of view, claims months for the first few months of the year. And the actuary says that we will still, at this point, there is no information that would lead him to think we're gonna end materially different from what we projected. So that's the financial. So, you know, we're watching
always nice
it,
to be
we're
kinda
monitoring it. We're doing okay.
Any questions about the financials, especially from new members to the board? Joel, I know you've seen something like this before, but it's been a while.
Always have questions.
It's over, it's,
And we can have Chris Roberts, who's the manager of finance, come to a board meeting, or she'll talk to each one of you separately if you wanna have a phone conversation, or come in and walk through it. She loves numbers, happy to go through it.
and with regular review at board meetings and with the updates we get by email, they really start to make sense. But it's important to remember always what we are expecting, which isn't always in the numbers, because we do commit reserves, we do expect deficits. So when you can layer on what we're expecting with the numbers, it gets easier.
And then I think the other management updates, Mark and Bobby Joe, are the lead on.
Okay, management updates.
Well, Bobby, Joe, Laura, and I have entered into a collaborative venture with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont. It's a new project. It has promise for future programs and activities. And the thrust of it is to initiate research that will ultimately help create programs to lower healthcare costs, both at the unit level and in the aggregate, to improve the quality of care, and also to, we hope, significantly improve cost and quality transparency in the healthcare system. Now, we're gonna have a lot more to say about this at the next board meeting, but we just wanted to lay a very basic introduction tonight, get you thinking about things, and then we'll return it to the next board member to elaborate on our thinking and to invite comments and questions. So this project has two initial stages. Now, the first stage is to collect comprehensive and detailed data on the current quality of care that's being delivered to school employees and their families, as measured by two standards. And forgive me for the jargon, but it's common in this field. PACS, potentially avoidable complications.
Oh, no, you can't do that.
And that could be anything, of course, from an infection rate that shouldn't be an infection rate, to hospital readmissions, that kind of thing. And potentially avoidable services, PAS, P-A-S for short. This could be antibiotic and opioid prescriptions that are not necessary, the inappropriate and excessive use of imaging technologies, unnecessary services. Again, there's a wide array of activities in either of these buckets. But the fact remains that when you look at research on this, both at the state level and national level, PACS and PAS drive an enormous amount of unnecessary spending, and they also cause medical harm. So we've asked Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont to join us in producing what we're calling, or what our future partners, we hope, are calling an opportunity report. And this report would be generated by an outfit called Prometheus Analytics. They are the leading figure in the United States or entity on the question of cost and quality metrics. They also do a variety of other things which we'll talk about in the future. But when it comes to cost and quality metrics, they are leaders in the field. They have contracts with Medicare and major state Medicaid systems like New York, Colorado, and Texas. We've had some conversations with them, and we have actually introduced them to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont as well. So what this report will do is it will analyze medical and financial costs after adjusting for risk for doctors and other providers and hospitals that are underperforming, that are generating what the data shows to be potentially avoidable complications, that may be excessively treating or prescribing treatments that are not necessary, compared to their counterparts, other doctors, providers, and hospitals that are adhering to best practices. That's what the opportunity report will point us in the right direction, I would hope. And that would lay sort of an empirical foundation for the next stage of our work. Ms. Soares.
Right, so it's really about getting data to see where are there these PACs and PASs in our own population, and then what would we do about them. Things that we think that we can work with Blue Cross to do is look, do we have centers of excellence in the state, for example, for knee replacements? Are there some hospitals that have much lower infection rates and readmission rates and complications than other hospitals? And so if so, and that's reliable and true over time, we should be communicating that to our members so that they can go and choose those centers of excellence. Also, we want to look at, if we do have centers of excellence and we have some centers that aren't looking very good, could we change our payment system with Blue Cross? You know, should there be a different pay differential based on outcomes? We also want to look at education. So is there an opportunity to educate providers, to share with them their own data, to see where they're not following what is nationally recognized standards like opioids, you know, and antibiotic overuse? Support providers in that area. Are there times we need to educate employees themselves about those same issues? And then we also want to use that information as we look at, over the next few years, our medical networks and our plan designs. So, you know, we expanded our medical networks with these new health plans, and that you could go anywhere in the whole Blue Cross national network. Is the next version of our network actually differentiate not by geography, but by excellence and quality? Do we consider something like that? As we look at plan benefit designs, what did we learn from this data? How does that help us use the health plans to get people high-quality care at the best cost? So we're gonna look at the data. Those are the kinds of things we can see that we might be able to do with the data. And Barbara Jo.
Sure, so in kind of phase two, we'll be looking at the data from Prometheus. And like Laura said, really working on educating employees and their families about who they get the care from, when, what services they receive. And then really looking into transparency about receiving the best quality and the best cost effective medication and services that are available. So as we receive this information, we'll bring it to the board, we'll explain how it works, and what we found from the data.
Yeah, that's fine.
Mark, I think you've talked about wishing for more of this for as long as I've been on the board.
Christmas came early?
Came 5 years in, but
All right.
it's exciting.
Who is Prometheus?
Didn't you fly into the sun?
He gave us fire.
A very
No,
low
that's-
ego.
We paid dearly for it.
This is from Wikipedia. And it's just the beginning. In Greek mythology, Prometheus is a Titan culture hero and trickster figure who is credited with the creation of man. So be careful what you who you work with.
The folks we've been talking with Prometheus don't have quite those grandiose visions of themselves, but we shall see.
I'm not embarrassed that I didn't know.
Well, that is a pleasant update, so thank you.
All right, I think just the other quick on there is that our dental rates were approved as filed. Anna indicated that the health rates are on the commissioner's desk, so we'll see how quickly we get that response. Don't know how that will quite go, but I expect an answer to that soon. We will notify you, and then we will quickly get that out to the field. We actually have an announcement ready, because that's important for budgets. People are meeting this time of year with budgets. The other thing that we're expect to speak to you about in the spring is potentially changing our pharmacy formulary. So we've got another couple of meetings with the pharmacy team at Blue Cross set up in early January. But we are looking at the ability to save some money with making some formulary changes without, or with very little, there's always disruption, with very little disruption on members. So we're really focusing on that disruption on members, what that would mean and look like and how we could manage it before we make a recommendation to you. But specialty drugs, which is our highest cost and fastest growing trend, if we change our specialty formulary, we can help control costs in that area. And for all other drugs, if we follow Blue Cross's lead and that they've done on the exchange, both of these things Blue Cross is doing on the exchange first, so they're kind of getting the, and moving in that direction, is it goes to a national formulary instead of, right now we have an open formulary, so you can pretty much get any drug. But if there's multiple drugs for the same condition, the national formulary takes the one that has the most science behind it, the best science behind it, that the most people are on. And by cutting off the drug that hardly anyone takes or isn't quite as efficacious, we might be able to save money. So we are looking at that, we wanted to give you a heads up about it.
When we spoke to you about 18 months ago or so about our drug trend in terms of spending, specialty drugs then accounted for roughly 34-35% of our spending. We're closing in on 50%. And that, by the way, is a national issue. We're not unique in that regard. And it's happening all over the country.
What do you mean by specialty?
These are those really new, brand name, expensive drugs. Often they're these biologics. Some of them, actually many of them often require infusions. They sometimes involve genetic engineering in the fabrication of them, production of them.
Usually have to be refrigerated or injected.
Yeah, they require special storage requirements and distribution requirements. And
You get lots of money for them.
and you can't, so they're very expensive.
Humira and,
Okay.
let's see, did you guys want to do any data path update? That was the other thing we wanted to.
Yeah, just really quick on data path, they continue to kind of, I'll be really quick.
Thank God you did it.
They do continue to struggle. They are working through finding some missing claims, and they have some adjustment issues that they're working on it. that they continue to work on. We assume this is going to go into Q1. They had about 45 groups in 2018, and they have lost 17 of them, so about just over a third of them for 2019. They do.
Groups is our people?
When I say groups, I mean like school districts or SUs, yep. Yeah, just Vermont schools. They do plan to keep the 2018 and the 2019 information separate to try to keep those buckets from
Contamination?
Yes, contamination. The only kind of caveat to that is some of these plans have rollovers.
Yeah.
And so it will ultimately have an impact, but they're trying to keep them separate for the most part to,
I'm sure they don't have any.
so.
Joe, I know that data path has been out in the front because of the debacle earlier, but is there any oversight, any ongoing looking at, checking into health equity? That's the one that our district uses, and it has been a far from perfect
Yeah.
operation as well, so has there been some?
They acted like, we had to rerun all their claims for the first 3 months because of a
Yeah, I
business
think
process problem that was not
For
health
some
equity.
district,
Brattleboro area.
I've had exceptional service from Health Equity.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, that's
Yes,
really
I
good.
do think that
Well,
your
they spent it
situation,
all on you.
I think your
Congratulations.
situation was specific, because of that issue, at the beginning of the year. But anything that does get brought up to us, we do bring up to their management,
Okay.
so certainly if there are ongoing issues, let me know.
Okay, thank you.
Happy to bring them up.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Right, don't have people be frustrated without telling Bobby Joe their frustrations, because then she can take it up and look for themes and problems.
Right.
It
She's the
definitely was earlier on, and I think there were a lot of phone calls made to a lot of people, and hopefully you didn't get them because people were not happy.
No, we got them.
Okay. Yes,
Do we have any update on Visters?
What about her?
Well,
On what?
that'd be a no.
the decision, what,
The
maybe I'm-
rates?
Yeah, the
Yes.
rates, yeah.
So, so the, no, in fact,
Good answer.
the
Right.
representatives from the state treasurer's office, we don't deal with the treasurer herself now in the rates, she has the deputy treasurer and another team, have indicated that until DFR makes a final decision about the rates, they assume that it's still possible that the reserves will be used to offset their rates. Anna indicated that the opinion on the commissioner's desk does not use any reserves, but that until the commissioner signs it, it is not final.
Okay, so that's flipped a couple times.
It's flipped a couple of times.
Trump-like.
We have 1 minute before 7 o'clock. Much that we wanted to accomplish on the agenda did not get accomplished and will be on a future agenda, including a wish to talk about agenda planning process. What I'd like to do is try and set another good 3-hour meeting. And with the understanding that we will continue to talk about the things not on the agenda, including agenda planning. And I'd like to offer to, one, continue to, Laura and I can continue, either one of us, accept suggestions for a future agenda. But if, we'd like to also have a designee to work with me on agenda to communicate about what the agenda plan is and why it is. I'm happy to have a teammate until we have a formal, full discussion. And if you'd like to be it, I'd be happy to.
I'm
Communicate
certainly
with you.
willing to take that on, but is there a way that I can hand up now the proposal so that people can look at it? So
Absolutely.
that we're ready to talk about it
Sure.
next time? It's a start.
Sure, absolutely, that's totally fine.
And so it, just so that folks have it as a way to kind of streamline.
Conversations in the
Yeah.
future, beautiful, thank
Move
you.
it forward.
Appreciate that.
Can I, Tracy, can I suggest just a slight tweak to what you just conned Peggy into doing?
I can call somebody else.
Make her, no,
That's fine too.
agree to make her a full participant in the development of the agenda with you and Laura for this coming meeting.
And the staff.
Oh, and of course.
Yeah, we wouldn't change our process here,
Right.
but just instead of me looking it over, I would check in with you.
Sounds
Okay.
good to me.
Tracy,
Well, as long as it works.
yes,
We tried it once.
You may.
I would like to, I don't think we got a chance to talk about this, but I would like to just present some of the topics that I would recommend the board consider putting on a future agenda, and no surprise, the first of those would be the
Mission.
Shocking, I know, so if I could submit that.
That would be great, and I'll get copies
sorry,
from
what's
them.
What was that word?
If we had gotten to
Oh.
a work plan
I'm sorry.
discussion, Elizabeth had things that she wanted to suggest that we put on our work plan, so we'll share
Yeah, but
that.
now she's on another group. It's gonna have to develop its own damn mission statement.
Good luck. So thank you for sharing that. I also think we should take a moment to thank you for your service to this board. Not always fun, it's not always rewarding, but it's important, and your insight and contributions
I
have
know
been
you
helpful.
all will do great work.
So, can we look at our calendars for January? And I need to begin by telling you that I am negotiating on Thursday nights. So unless and until that's resolved, I'm not available on Thursday nights. Nor am I available Monday or Tuesday evenings, so I have Wednesdays and Fridays.
You negotiate every Thursday?
That's what's on my calendar.
Wednesdays is when we have board meetings.
So the question is,
So-
what's the first Wednesday available? Is that the question?
Is there a Wednesday that you have available that we could look at for, I'm assuming the 4 to 7 time slot works for people given travel and school and,
It works, but I really do have, I think I traveled, do I travel the longest?
Yes, you do.
So I really have full support from my district, so if I need to get out a little bit early in order to accommodate other folks, they'll work with me around that,
That's
so.
I mean,
Just-
3 to 7.
Does that work with you?
Right, so.
Yeah, I
make
can-
it-
I
make
can
it more
also-
convenient for folks.
My superintendent
So,
was assured that my work here was,
I can back you up on that when I see him.
Yeah.
Really have to take a half day.
It feels,
I don't
I'm
control
I'm being presumptuous, but it feels like they might be able to move it.
yeah, I see this.
If they could meet at 2,
At 2?
I can take a
We
half
can
a
do-
day. if
Perhaps
it's ready
We
with
can
some plans,
join,
yada, yada,
we can
yada,
have you
but-
set up by phone. I know,
yeah,
I don't
so-
like phone
Like phone.
myself, I like to be there in person, but we'll
We're the
set it
same.
up,
But
okay?
Thank you for
It also means, as painful as it is, that there's more time available in a day that
It
begins
would
at
work
2.
to be done.
Yeah.
So I'm looking to mark that, and can you join us in the scheduling conversation? Not you, Elizabeth, I'm looking past you.
Yeah.
I'm looking past you already, Robert, disappeared.
You're saying a Wednesday or a Friday?
Which means a Wednesday.
Wednesday,
Yeah, right. I'm sorry, Wednesday the?
Wednesday.
I'm looking to mark
First available one would be the 9th, because I have a board meeting on the 2nd and another one on the 16th.
All
And
right.
it's budget season, so
Can
those
we do it on the
will not be
9th?
canceled.
Well, we have a meeting with Blue Cross that goes until 3.
No.
That's our
You wanna
Visitors
see if we
work
can
plan.
reschedule that?
That's the Visitors work plan. We can move that one,
You
yeah,
can
it's
move
not the Brian one, which would be.
No.
very-
Right, that's
It's just
different.
So the 9th?
January 9th, we're talking 2 o'clock. 2 till,
Can you make the January 9th date?
Yes.
2 till,
Wouldn't be good to start your tenure by saying no.
Right. No, I think 2 till, what are we saying?
that's what I'm looking to you for. This was a 3-hour meeting.
A 3-hour tour,
Careful, Gilligan.
or, well, Professor.
Or like a skipper.
Can we say 5 in there?
Can folks do 6?
6 o'clock?
Till 6?
Let's split it, 6,
Okay.
all right?
You want supper? You want dinner, I would assume?
No?
No, no,
Well,
Snacks.
guess Mike.
snacks.
The public to be
We're
heard
gonna
by.
break the bank, right here.
I'm gonna go with the Latovsky cookie maker.
All right, we'll have snacks, but we won't provide a full dinner. Okay.
I'm not-
Coffee as long as
We
I
always
get
have
the-
coffee in the building and water,
I
just so you
have
know.
some water.
All right, could I have a motion to adjourn, please?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Actually, do you want to try to grab a February one?
No, I know, because I'd rather do that work plan and figure out what we need to do and how we're gonna do it. And maybe I'll be done negotiations then.
Probably have some different
That's
rates
not
in
funny.
February, so that might be.
That's right, we have different rates.
You could help, oh no, you
You're in
can't
the most
technically.